All right, you want to start, Tyler?
Yeah. Welcome to the weekly Bevry discussion group, where we will continue going over the Vervaeke series regarding awakening from the meaning crisis. This week we're discussing lecture 13, and I'm not sure if any of this even matters because I don't know if you can hear it or not, but welcome to the discussion. And we have Susan, Sumit, Pod, and John today. I think we'll have a great and fascinating discussion for you.
Right. Yeah. All right. So we're going to be discussing his 13th lecture, Buddhism and Parasitic Processing, in which Vervaeke kind of lays out a different way at looking at Buddhism that kind of differs from how we typically go about this. So you might think about Buddhism as a set of beliefs similar to how you might think about Christianity or in any other faith, that you accept these beliefs and that makes you a Buddhist. Like if you accept the Four Noble Truths of Buddha, then that makes you a Buddhist. But really, he's kind of shifting our way of thinking about it so that the Noble Truths are more to do with ideas that are supposed to help us transform like the Buddha, in that by accepting these things, it changes the way that we look and interact with the world, so that we're not going to be caught up in the very things that he's discussing, that Buddha mentions as part of the Noble Truths. I should actually, I think...
John,
yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to correct you before you go too much on this. So that's how they usually teach at the classes. So when you say he's doing that in a different way, actually he's not, because they themselves say that if we tell you these four truths, then that doesn't do anything for you. You actually have to live them and work them and actually practice them. So that's, I think that's part of the this thing, Buddhist teaching itself. So if Vervaeke is preaching that, then that's not very different from what actually they teach at the Buddhist places.
Right.
Well, I think what he's saying is that it's that the West tends to misunderstand Buddhism, and that we here in the West tend to focus on the knowledge aspect, which you're right. So you're not in the West, Sumit. So you probably don't see that as much. But that's exactly his point. That the real thing focuses more on the being mode than the knowing mode.
Right. So,
which is interesting in the context of what you just said. You're not in the West, right? It's actually strangely mixed, the East and the West now. It's hard to pull them apart. In fact, the cultural influences are quite intense.
Well, I guess he's in India, where it's probably more true. No, I was saying he's in India, where they probably don't fall into those same misunderstandings as much as we do, say, North America.
Well, it's also Vervaeke's kind of presenting it to a lot of people that probably haven't gone through any type of meditation retreats or Buddhist practices. And so for them that have kind of no real interaction with Buddhism on a personal level, all they have is kind of this kind of understanding that they get from the culture. And they probably do share a sense of just thinking that Buddhism is to do with kind of the beliefs that you hold. But no, I think it's really fascinating how he presents the Four Noble Truths as something that are to do with transforming the person so that they can go through kind of the same process as Siddhartha.
Right.
And
it seems like all things take on shape through a process, right? There's something that molds them. There's some set of forces or fields or whatever language you want to use, right? That makes things into a certain shape, combines them in unique ways, or Okay, so we don't have to go down that road, but I was talking about the acorn and the oak tree, right? So I said the potentiality of the oak exists within the seed, and that's true, but it also requires the external forces of the environment in order to find that ultimate shape, right? Because it's the actual air pressure itself that the growths of the seed are moving into. And that has an effect on the direction that the tendrils take as they move in the three-dimensional space of the atmosphere, right? Like there are actual direct relationships between the figure and the ground in any relationship.
So it's kind of like the agent arena relationship, but in regards to objects themselves. So like an acorn, when it's within the correct arena, is able to fulfill its identity as a tree.
Right, right. Like so if it were growing underwater, right, you don't get the same acorn growing into the same tree.
Which we'll definitely get into on his discussion of addiction, which I think was kind of the most fascinating aspect of this lecture. But before we do that, if we want to kind of like go through each person, if there's some sort of like overall takeaway or something that they want to discuss, maybe on a sort of the meta view of like Vervaeke's project, that might be interesting for people that want to do so. I don't know if Brett, you want to say something?
Sure. I mean, first I'm finding like it's just amazing how it's just great how he builds each of his lectures, and he has these themes that he sets out early on, and as he's going through, you see these same themes, but he's branching them out, and it's becoming more practical. I mean, this one, I mean, I have my issues with depression and anxiety, and this episode really focused on that. So a lot of the things in this episode really hit home. I think this is a very useful episode for people with depression, anxiety, or like you said, addiction, because he describes the practices, he describes sort of the habits you get into, and these the system you get into, and this loop you get into that really rang true for me, the way he described it, and which if what he's saying is true, that the science supports this, it suggests the way out, which is what is really interesting, but also seems fairly daunting, because it's, the key is that it's not just about the knowing. It's not just knowing about these systems or knowing about, these loops and these processes. Without the practice, you're not likely to escape it, is his point. So
the key is not the same thing as the lock, right?
Yeah, I like that. It's the, if you don't do it, if you don't follow these sort of these psychosocial, what is he phrasing? These psychosocial technologies. Technologies. Then you're not likely to escape, the suffering that is caused by these processes. So that's what I really took out of this episode.
Yeah. We'll have to go into his definition of the first noble truth, or articulation of it with the out of jointness. But I don't know if Sumit or Susan, you'd like to say something regarding Vervaeke's lecture.
I think I can go after Susan.
I can go.
Yep.
Not so much on the last lecture. Has anyone looked at the Mark Lewis? I went and looked ahead at Mark Lewis to see what he says. He gets a lot into the science. He's into the addictions. Who was the guy who was an addict, and then he became a cognitive scientist. Overall, since I haven't been here for the other discussions, the thing that struck me most that I could understand and felt was when he talked about flow, being in the flow, insight. First you get an optical grasp, and then insight, then it leads to flow, and I definitely felt that in my career as nursing. And I used to be I used to feel that way when after, say, 6 or 7 years of nursing, I would look forward to going to work because I felt like I was in the flow all the time. You know, I was able to reframe things, like how he talks about perspectival stuff. And I would pick up on things going on with my patients. I worked on a critical care, mostly cardiac in my younger years, and be able to pick up on things with people. So I think I kind of naturally developed that thing without having a words to describe what was happening. Am I making sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's one of the things I really appreciate about Vervaeke's lectures is you can kind of see a pattern with a lot of each of the individual episodes with that kind of flow state or a reciprocal feedback loop. And this is like the first lecture, I think, where he brings in, well, actually, no, he's kind of talked about it before on the Socrates lecture, but how this very same kind of looping mechanism can be detrimental for us in the instance of addiction. And like he kind of explains kind of the very feedback mechanism and loop that occurs when somebody is addicted. That is really interesting. And yeah, I like being able to see I guess that pattern of flow or things working off of each other to build each other up within a lot of these different lectures that he does.
What's interesting, he really gives the language to talk about this, and it sounds jargony when you sort of say it. Just optimize your grasp on the reality, but this concept of flow and grasp, I'm finding more and more just in my daily life. There's a difference between just knowing something and understanding it and grasping it. So, like for nursing, you could say you go to nursing school and you learn a bunch of stuff, but you don't really know it yet. But as you practice, as you go through it, then you start to get into the flow, and you could say you really grasp it. You have your grip on it. You've optimized your grip. And I think that just having that language, I think, is useful in terms of approaching just things we learn every day. If someone can give you information, but you don't necessarily get it right away, even though if you can understand it intellectually, it doesn't always grok. So
yeah, well, I kind of likened it, getting an optimal grasp was like when I was in nursing classes and studying. So I would be looking at things in all different directions. I asked tons of questions. I drove everyone in my classes nuts, and then see what's the next step. And then when I started to practice as a young nurse, and I would say, oh, okay, when this happens, or this, and then so you're getting so then you're getting insights all the time, and it's just like almost on a daily basis when you're a young nurse, because everything is so new and you're putting so many different pieces together. And then when you enter that flow state where you feel like you're in the groove and you feel comfortable in your skin, you feel, you can walk into that room and you're not afraid that you're going to miss something, or that. Then that was the period of time when I really looked forward to going to work. It was like, I can't believe I get paid for this. I just couldn't believe it. People actually pay me to do this. And it was a sacredness, and there's a sacredness in nursing, because you're in there at periods of time and you know things about people that only usually close family is privy to, so you enter like the sacred circle of that person and their family, especially in periods of like when they're in the dying process, or they're end stage congestive heart failure. And then you're sometimes dealing with the family more so than the patients. But it was there was a lot of feeling of sacredness that I felt when I was nursing. And I felt privileged. And that flow, yeah, Yeah, you felt good. It was, I'm sure there was adrenaline, you know, going through it, and physical things going on in my body.
Well, I think, you know, Vervaeke's point of this whole course is that by practicing these psychotechnologies, the idea is to get into that flow state with just our everyday interactions with life, just our everyday agent arena relationships that we have all the time, multiple times throughout the day, so that we're sort of in that flow state, not just with, you know, our work where, you know, where you may have done, you know, you get into that flow state with your job because you practiced it so much, you can get into that flow state. So these psychotechnologies are designed, I think, to get you into the, you know, the flow state for life.
Well, remember, expertise was a part of that. They came down from the flow thing. You had to have an actual, like I fence, where I used to fence until my back got bad. But, you know, you have to, actually, you have to have a skill to know that, for that feedback loop. That was a part of it. So I don't see how you can be like an expert at everything in your everyday life.
Well, I think it's not that it's an expert on everything. It's becoming expert at assessing the arena and your role to it. So it's not that you're an expert on every aspect of life, but I think his point is you can become an expert at just assessing.
Right. Yeah, you can kind of like build up the skill of determining what skill level that you're at for a given thing. So like if you're in a situation where you're the most experienced person in the room, then you can use the, I guess, skill of scaling
Scaling up and scaling down.
Scaling up and scaling down to kind of determine what identity you're going to adopt for that situation. But if you're that same person, but you're in a room of like much higher experts than you, then you're going to have to like kind of scale down your own identity to be the learner rather than the teacher.
Break your frames and let the reorganization occur, which, according to Vervaeke, occurs naturally.
Well, I'm guessing that, like, in that analogy, you know, people who suddenly find themselves, you know, in an environment where everybody else seems to know more than them, they feel very uncomfortable. You would call that modal confusion. My guess is what Vervaeke is saying is, if you're good at this practice, or if you use these practices, you may not feel that confusion. You may be just okay with that. You'll be okay with that. Okay, these guys know more than me. And my role, maybe I'll have a different role. I can provide color commentary or whatnot, or I can just learn. And you won't feel that nervousness. I think that anxiety that can come from not understanding your place, or not really grasping what is my role here. You'll become better at figuring out your role. Tyler, is that in line with what you? Yeah.
And to maybe tie together the pieces, the Susan's historical experience of nursing and the discussion of finding out what the rules of the game are, because it seems like that's the level of intelligence that Vervaeke is really talking about, is the cognitive capacity to find out what the rules of the game are, the appropriate rules of the game, rather than just how to play those rules better and better. And that there's a trade-off between those two capacities to learn how to work the rules within the system better and better, right? To become more skilled at them, to become better at the skills of nursing. And then there's also another direction you can go where you can say, well, why am I nursing, right? You can go the opposite direction. You can kind of explode possibility outwards, and you can take those tasks and skills that you drilled down into and created as a nurse, and then open your gaze out to the rest of the world and apply those skills in a kind of exaptation of that expertise. And that weird process of drilling down and learning expertise and then popping out of that system and applying it somewhere else is the process of metaphor and the process of analogy. It's this weird capacity that we seem to have to learn something in one place and then move it over. So it made me think of a phrase that often comes to mind, but from the Eastern wisdom again, I suppose, in honor of Vervaeke, that But this is from Japan. Miyamoto Musashi is a famous swordsman. Wrote a very famous book. And in it, he said that from one thing, you can know 10,000 things. He follows up with something like, when you have attained the way of strategy, there's not one thing you cannot do. And it's this concept of learning in one domain and then being able to take it across to something else entirely that you find some commonality with, and yet it is in a different environment. And it's definitely something unique that humans demonstrate in their capacity to do as we move about in all the various different environments. We can adapt to any place we find ourselves as long as we're willing to do it.
Once you finish going around the circle, I'd like to come back to this idea of the metaphorical language and you know what these metaphors are doing for us that links into what he said. So let's circle back to that point after we've finished going around.
You're gonna say something, Susan, and then we'll go into use of it. Sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, I think that I have exapted that. I've noticed those skills that I learned in the profession of nursing, that I have exapted the ability to size up situations, assess things, focus, pick up on cues, you know, and it's definitely been I've exapted it. And then someone will say, well, Susan, how did you notice that? And I said, well, I was trained to do that. You know, like just the other day, I was talking to Tim McGrew and I said, oh, your wrists are smaller. And he goes, no, they're not. I never had big wrists. And I said, well, look where you're wearing your watch. You're wearing it higher up on your arm. And I said, I can see a white mark on your wrist where your watch used to be. So you're wearing your watch up higher on your arm. You know, I said, and I told him, I said, see, as a nurse, I was told to be able to pick up on certain things, assess things like that. You know, that's just a simple example. I'm done.
Yeah, it's Susan, very Sherlock Holmesian.
Yeah, I don't know if it's you, but I hear a Discord blooping in the background. I'm not sure if it's being picked up on your end or if it's I don't know, maybe it's like it's making me go crazy trying to figure out where it's
turn
coming
the Discord from. Off.
You can put it on Do Not Disturb mode.
Oh, okay, let me look.
Or if you have headphones, that should stop it from going on the stream. It's probably getting picked up by your. Are you using headphones, or it's probably getting picked up by your speaker?
By my computer speaker.
Right. So if you listen with headphones, we won't hear any of the internal sounds.
But all right, Sumit, do you have anything like particular from this lecture that you'd like to go talk about?
Yes. Actually, it was just more my subjective experience. So I was just telling a friend of mine that he has a friend, and I was like, you know, people are supposed to hate people like your friend. And what I meant by that was that, you know, this guy, he's successful. I've been told he gets along with his family really well. And, you know, he's doing great at his career. He's really happy. And so, and where that comes from is this. I know you're supposed to admire people like that, right? That's what I used to do. But what
you can resent them.
What's been happening lately is, and I discussed this with Tyler earlier, that, you know, I have tried out a couple of things to take care of some issues I have, and they don't work, and over time you kind of become a cynic. So for example, this Mark Levy's character, so he was addicted to something and then he recovered it, and then he became a neuroscientist. So to a person like myself, I would be like, so you can just become a neuroscientist? I mean, you can become things? I mean, you want to? Really? Because when I try to become something, I run into so many roadblocks, and I was almost at this place where I was like, you know, a lot of despair and just kind of giving up, but still trying And what I got from this lecture was that obviously you can never stop trying, because then, I mean, what are you going to do, right? So even if you think nothing is going to work out, you still keep trying something, because else what you do? I mean, you just sit there whole day and do what? So what I got from the lecture was that when he was explaining this whole cycle of addiction, how it reinforces itself, and how it colors your judgment with all the biases that are at play, right? And we can go through that diagram when we are discussing it fully. So, and he was saying, if you try to break this cycle from by doing any one thing, right? So it's just going, it's like a live creature. It will reconfigure itself and it will just come back. So that actually kind of gave me hope that, okay, so maybe I was, I had the wrong model of fixing these problems. Maybe I need to, look at the approach that Vervaeke is talking about in order to be a better person, overcome addiction, and be more disciplined, and have less procrastination and all that. So there is some hope. So that, yeah, that's what I got.
Well, I mean, for sure, it shows a way forward. Now, I mean, to me, I felt through all this thing, it just seems so daunting. But it does suggest there's still a way forward. But it also means some commitment to that way forward, and that's what seems scary, or the anticipation. Again, daunting was the word that just popped into my head the whole time. But I think that's what this course is maybe designed to break down those barriers, to help convince us that, to grasp that this is a good thing, that there's science that backs it up. It's not just, there's ancient traditions here, but regardless of what you think about the actual beliefs about them, they got some things right that are very useful, that it's backed by science. And yes, it's a lot of work. And I think that's why he has a theme, don't just do it alone, have some guidance, but that it's probably very useful for all of us in some ways or another.
Yeah, my only thing about that is that, when once you enter this cycle where you are really into despair, or you are depressed, not clinically, but feeling depressed, that your ability to try anything kind of goes down even. So I don't want to get too excited about it.
Well, that's right. And I think what he makes clear is it's not just like a pill you take and it's all fixed. You have to practice. That the idea is that a lot of this stuff is unconscious. You have to sort of get your brain into a state where these good things happen. But it's not that you're directly willing or directly doing something to directly cause these good things to happen. It's that by, engaging in things like meditation and contemplative practices and and disruptive thinking, if you do it enough, your brain will then start generating those good things as well. So, but again, I think the other side is, if you don't do these things, you're not going to have as many. You're not going to be in those optimal brain states. So, yeah, it's a lot of there's work.
Yeah, that's a really, I think, I guess, unique component to Vervaeke that kind of separates him from Peterson in a lot of ways. There's quite a few different things that they differ on, but in a way you can kind of frame them as both focusing on the same problem, but from different methods and also different frameworks in order to understand the problem. But something that, like, him and Peterson, they had like a conversation back in, I guess, 2015 maybe, because they both work at the University of Toronto. That they kind of honed their disagreement on, where Vervaeke, he's very much more aware of the environmental components that shape what a person does and who that person is and how they interact with their environment in a more, I guess, externalist, almost deterministic sort of way. and he's right in a lot of ways that like the area or the arena in which you're located within is what's going to shape your behavior for within it. Whereas I guess Peterson is more about building up the characters so that it can withstand any area, any arena that it finds itself within. And like both are very necessary components to, I guess, having a good life and having a good society. But I think Vervaeke is very much, I don't know, he seems to have a much better grasp of what actually allows for the behaviors that we want to see from ourselves in order to actually put them into, to get them to respond to our will. So like we can have the desire to do a thing, but if we're in an environment in which that desire is never going to actually be fulfilled, then we have to think about how we're reshaping the environment so that it can be fulfilled. Like he brings up a really like awesome example of like if people are put into a classroom and given a list of vocabulary words that they're supposed to try to memorize. And then they're put into, like, you take these two groups, one that's put into a different room and then are supposed to take a test on how many of those words that they remembered. And then the other group is put back into the same room that they learned the words in. The people that were in the same room have a better ability to return to those memories that they've formed inside that room. And it's something I've noticed for myself as well, because like there's like when I would listen to podcasts while like mowing the lawn or something like that, I had this like locational association with the things that I was listening while I was mowing the lawn during that during that phase. So like if I needed to return to a point in a podcast, I could remember where it was based upon where I like stopped mowing the lawn in that area, since we had a pretty large yard there. It's really fascinating to think about like what are the other components by which information is associated into us that are due to like our social encounters and our environment, our location, all these other things that are also there than you can really get by just like say reading a book.
Yeah, I think my daughter just came into. She wanted to wave and do a walk in, but yeah, I think Peterson is like I think a little more prescriptive than Vervaeke, where Peterson will say, you know, clean your room, and that's like in a way he's it's prescriptive, you know, organize yourself, and then you can organize the world. So the practice is by organizing yourself, you'll get better at organizing, you know, everything else. But I think Vervaeke is more. He's not giving like Vervaeke wouldn't give 12 rules for life. He'd say, I think you follow this practice and you will get better at figuring out what rules you should follow to optimize your grip. So I think to some extent that's probably why someone like Peterson is much more famous than Vervaeke, because Peterson goes straight more to the point of, you know, do this and it'll fix your life. Whereas Vervaeke's a lot less, you know, he's giving you the way to help yourself get to that stage. He's not just telling you what to do, except for telling you, if you do this, you will put your brain in a state that will help you figure out everything else.
Yeah, sure. No, and it's funny too, just to notice the different like styles and approach that they go through. Because like you watch a Peterson lecture and it's just like a free flowing river that's just going in any different direction. Whereas Vervaeke, he's like a branching and collapsing of different like related topics all together that have to do with each other. It's almost like Vervaeke kind of creates this story cycle for each lecture. Like he'll present a problem, the different solutions that were attempted to resolve that problem, and then like a more focused understanding of what the problem is, and then from there kind of the responses to that, now that we have a better understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why Peterson appeals more, but it's a more dogmatic approach, because you could think, okay, yes, these things, like he's focused these 12 rules that will help you in certain situations, but they may not adapt as well. But they're sort of easy, like, oh, he's telling me what to do. Okay, I'm going to do it. And probably, I think people have good results, but you're probably going to hit a wall. My guess is that there's more of a wall with Peterson than with Vervaeke. But with Vervaeke, because he's not giving you the way forward, you've got to do a lot of the work yourself, which is a lot more daunting. Versus Peterson, it's sort of like, oh, just follow it and things are going to go well. So
yeah.
So in some sense, the meaning crisis, if you kind of make it generic, is when anybody starts complaining about the world, right? When they're just complaining about their life, when they're saying to the rest of the world, I'm not sure why I exist, why I'm here. I don't have a good understanding of what's going on. And that can happen for myriad reasons, right? So anyone who is in that condition is probably in a system that isn't explaining enough about the world, or has no capacity to allow them to alter the world to get back into alignment, right? Back on the path, is to use the language of the East there. Although that language shows up in the West too. Okay, but I was thinking about something, John, when you were talking about mowing the grass. I had the same thing. I used to mow the lawn as a job, and all the other equipment. But I would have the same thing. Now, this is before podcasts were really a thing. But my own thoughts, I would come back around and I would reach that spot and I would say, oh, here is the spot where I was thinking about X. And then I would dive back into that thought and kind of revisit it. And, the Greeks had the method of loci, the memory palace. It's another name for it, where you can dramatically increase the capacity of your memory to recall a linear sequence of events, or even a constellation of different objects and ideas. If you take a familiar geographical memory, like a house or a place that you visit often, and attach to specific places within that memory the kinds of things that you want to remember, be it a grocery list or a set of concepts around a particular philosophy or whatever, right? You can do it. When I first learned about it, actually, the very first thing I used it for was the creation of a presentation, a talk. I memorized the sequence of concepts I wanted to discuss, and then I just kind of walked through the building as I gave the talk, and it was a marvelously successful way to do it. But I think what's going on here, to bring in some cognitive science, because we're with Vervaeke, right? So I think what's going on there is that the brain is always processing marvelous amounts of information, and you can think of them as little pipelines of just very complicated waveforms, right? Like imagine an oscilloscope or something with a sinusoidal waves. Now imagine 10,000s of those stacked on top of each other, and a million and a billion, or who knows what's processing in the brain, right? But you're getting audio signals from the podcast, you're getting vibrational signals from your body bouncing up and down, and vibrating, and then like there's breeze on your face. There's all sorts of stuff going on, and all of that is sense data being processed through a kind of pipeline that we call this centralized attention node, right? Your conscious awareness. And there's stuff going on underneath that too. But if something comes along that you want to remember, like dramatically, or that is important, I think what the brain does is it takes a little cross section of that pipeline that's passing through both the salient conscious and the unconscious aspects, and it does a freeze frame of that state. It just does a snapshot, right? And depending on the capacities of your own internal snapshot and the various modules that are running, you can recall more or less aspects of the environment as it was frozen, right? But when you are engaged in an environment that is already passing that same set of signals through, it dramatically increases the capacity for you to recall those specific set of waveforms, right? Because they are already in existence. And that is why being in the location matters. This is also related to the other point that I wanted to talk about, which before was this notion of determining the set of rules in a game and then when to pull out. And I think those are both related, if I can bring in some other religious language, to this notions of justice and mercy. And this also ties in with notions of the left and right hemispherical capacities. And I think that has a lot to do with determining a set of rules that works for a particular environment. In other words, being in the flow state, let's say, being skilled in a particular set, is one way of going about this kind of left hemispherical, well-satisfied, well-functioning environment. But every now and then, something in the environment tells you that's not good enough, right? It could be as dramatic as a traumatic event, like a car crash suddenly, like you can't keep going the way you are. Or it could be as simple as, you know, your watch doesn't fit anymore. Are you losing weight, right? Or noticing club fingers or something, right? It could be something really simple. And it's this noticing something in the environment. It can also be the internal environment, right? The headspace. That it's like a little nag. It's like, this is mercy, by the way. It's a statement essentially, which is the way things are is not correct, not just. We have to look at something else. We have to figure something else out. And this is exactly like what you see happen in like parental relationships in the ordinary traditional sense. Like the father will come into discipline, let's say, or anyone will come into discipline, doesn't matter. And this is this very masculine convergent sense of something wrong was done and now it must be fixed to make it right. That's convergence, right? If it's too harsh, if it's not doing it properly, the woman is supposed to tug on the arm of the man and offer mercy to the child, or the child's supposed to run to the woman is to protect the child from the wrath of the justice in the man. Like these kinds of behaviors play out all the time in our childhood ordinarily. And I think those actual behaviors, those stories and narratives playing out as children help imprint these patterns of behaviors in these hemispherical relationships, right? So when we go out into the world, we ourselves have within us a very long history in our childhood of people enacting these two different ways of being. Discovering the skill set and the flow state for a particular set and enacting it as a type of justice. And then the determination of whether, the constant determination of whether or not that set of patterns is proper or good and whether or not we should try something else, which is something like mercy.
All right. Well, we'll have to get back into the justice mercy connection, but it is, that's something that I think Vervaeke is touching on to a good degree here, and really hammering home is the interconnectedness to even beliefs and experiences, just that have much more to do than kind of like a propositional knowledge of a thing. Like it's even that is kind of connected to our relationship to as an agent within an arena, and also the social components and the environmental components and the building up of different heuristics that we have in our cognition. In fact, he brings in this graph. Oh wait, let me see. Or this, the anxiety feedback loop is what I have it titled as. In order to explain the first noble truth of Buddha, that life is suffering. Let me see if I can share my screen real quick. Sorry. All right, so the first noble truth that, like, we could think of it as just a belief that we have, that life is suffering, like an explanation to what all of life is. And okay, I wanted to connect it to what you were saying there, Tyler, because you had mentioned how like we have this kind of tugging that something's wrong, and this is our first step in the process. And he brings in this example of like what's trying to be articulated by life is suffering is that we have these cognitive heuristics that can can kind of have this downward spiral with themselves, in which it's just re-upping the sufferingness to life. Okay, so how does he explain it exactly? That,
well, here maybe you want me to try to so when he talks about all life is suffering, the first thing he's noting, these sayings, like these slogans, so to speak, are not meant to be taken as literally. Buddha is not saying everything in life is suffering. If that was the case, then nothing would be suffering. Suffering is a comparative term. What he brings it to is basically loss of agency. So that when you're he compares it to the parable of the monkey getting stuck in pitch, who then is just stuck there until he dies. Now that monkey is not in pain, he's not being tortured, but he's stuck there until he eventually then gets killed by somebody.
Yeah, like the very act of trying to like pull yourself out of the pitch will just kind of pull you closer and closer into it.
And that the more we, when we, that suffering, we can suffer pleasure as well. So, if you're in a state of ecstasy, you can say you're suffering pleasure because you're in such a state that you've lost your agency. It's not in your control. And I think that really, when you think about things like depression, or just when you feel like you're suffering, you sort of feel helpless and lost, that what he's talking about with all life is suffering is that you are always at risk. You're perpetually at risk of this loss of agency that can have detrimental effects on your life.
Right. Yeah. So you don't go to see the Buddha and ask him what his path is unless you're suffering, right? And so the necessary ground of being for all people approaching a new understanding is first that they are suffering. Something's wrong. That's the noticing that something's wrong in the environment. If it's wrong enough to go seek the Buddha at this level, let's say, it is characterized by the word in English as suffering, right?
And even if you're not currently suffering, you are always at risk of suffering. That these cognitive faculties we have that help us self-organize, that help us, assess our place in the world, that help us, just deal with everything, that apply these heuristics, they are used necessarily adaptively for us to live, but they can also have a downside, and they can be used to cause a lack of agency, which leads to suffering.
Well, consider the left hemisphere the petitioner and the right hemisphere the Buddha, okay? But consider it a failed Buddha, like a poor imitation of Buddha. And so when the rule sets fail, it reaches back into this source of creativity and imagery and narrative and whatever it needs to try to construct sense of the world, some new sense. And that's asking the Buddha, what's the way, right?
But he also talks that it's that there's so much information out there. We're taking so much data that we have to have these shortcuts. Our brains sort of have to take these shortcuts, which he calls heuristics. So that we have these biases because we have to sort of quickly reach these assessments, or else we're going to be paralyzed. We're not going to be able to function.
Right.
And so it really helps us. Yeah.
Consider the petitioning process to be a fairly complicated multi-step one. You have to go through the processes and engage the modules in the proper way. Otherwise, it doesn't work out. So when you petition the right hemisphere, which is the source of all neuroses and anxieties and such, right? When you petition it, you have to do it in the proper way. You have to make sure that you're engaging the regions in the way, and that the other related behaviors around your organism can support the right hemisphere in its capacity to start telling the left hemisphere once again what it needs to do to get back into the flow state. Right? That's essentially what's going on. And it's what's so fascinating about this is that it was written large in Buddha and Buddhism and this process. And now we're discovering that the left and right hemispheres are engaged in something very similar, right? Isn't that wild? Isn't that really wild? I think it's really wild. Yeah, so that's what's going on in there.
So Vervaeke brings up this analogy to kind of exemplify the point that life is suffering. It as a like a wheel on an axle, but it's not perfectly in the center of the axle. It's kind of misaligned, such that if you are to use this wheel, then it's going to be constantly degrading itself through its usage, and it's like going to be bumpy and all these other things, and that are just by trying to use it further is just going to kind of tear it apart, similar to the monkey that touches the pitch and then tries to pull itself out and then gets further stuck into it. And I think this is where it connects to the second noble truth of Buddhism that he doesn't actually go into, but I think it's something like that all suffering is a subjective, something like that. Let me see.
No, it was, I think it was desire leads to suffering.
Desire leads to suffering. Okay, so by losing desire, then we lose the suffering associated with it.
So that was interesting because it was then that he talked about this circular loop that you can get into, that me and POD were discussing last time, that you desire enlightenment, but that can lead to suffering. So then you don't desire enlightenment. So that's that confusion we were having.
Well, and he frames it in terms of attachment, that when we're attached to something, we've narrowed the world, we've narrowed our options, and so that our agency and options are lost. And he brings it into depression and anxiety and
addiction,
and that then all of these, in each of these, really what's causing our suffering is our narrowing of the options, where we feel we're stuck in this path. And so the second noble truth is getting at realizing that you can break that attachment, and I think that you have more options, that you're not stuck in that
right
path. And again,
it's very much connected to his 9-dot problem, where like if you think of the 9-dot problem as like a square, kind of that thing, if you can break out of that frame, then you can actually resolve it.
But look, like you can tell somebody, hey, you have these options, and you can tell them, hey, other people have had these problems and they've gotten out of it, or they've come out of, they've made their lives better. And you can tell somebody all that, and they can say, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but it's not enough just to sort of, I know this from my own, experience with depression and anxiety. Like, you can understand, yeah, I understand it's theoretically possible to come out of this, but just knowing that doesn't get you out of it. You need these psychotechnologies to counteract that you put up that graph, which shows the system, the self-reinforcing system, and the idea of these that if you just focus on one of the aspects of that system and sort of fix it, well, the system itself comes back in to bring you back to that cycle of suffering. So what you need to do is sort of hit the whole system. You have to hit all the parts at once, and that the psychotechnologies, the practice of it, is designed to give you a new dynamic system that sort of breaks this system of suffering.
Right. And that's an interesting thing. Like it's not something in which just having a psychotechnology is enough to really resolve it. Like there has to be this is probably why he brings in like why you should have some sort of teacher in order before going into any sort of higher state of consciousness, or even in meditation, things like that, is you can have somebody there that is going to give you that has a much more experienced life in which they can deal with these types of issues than you. Like, what's the Mitch Hedberg joke? I taught myself how to play guitar, but the thing is I'm a really shitty teacher, so I'm not any good at it. It's like, so we can have the psychotechnologies, but we also have to have this embodied practice that is very much tied to like where we are in our environment, what are our social connections and situations that we're dealing with, and like, do we have the freedom to actually put these things into practice, despite having, or not despite, do we have the added components necessary to resolve the suffering that we're going through?
Right, like he's not giving anybody, this is how you get out of it. Like Peterson would say, these are the steps to take. But if you practice these psychotechnologies, which again I think mainly focus on meditation and contemplative practices, plus these strategies of consciously disrupting your thought, that you will ostensibly figure out how to do this. Now, I mean, again, it sounds really, because he's not as definitive as Peterson, like it sounds to somebody who hasn't gone through it like, new age, whatever, like, oh, it sounds great, but does it actually work? I think that's why he's bringing in all the science. He's saying, hey, I can't just tell you it works. I can tell you the science supports this, and then you just have to do it. Like and it'll benefit you, but it's not like a quick fix. But it sounds so like amazing. This is just fix everything. This will fix your life. But I think we have to recognize it's not. None of it's going to be that simple, and all of this is based on a long practice. Which again, right. You've got to. Which the harder it is to do reduces the ability of the practical ability of people to do it. So I guess that's where I say it's daunting. Like, is this something I'm up to doing? Am I up to going through what's needed to achieve what he's talking about? Like, he's convinced me enough that there's enough backing that it's worth pursuing. I think that's his main goal. But the thought of doing it is pretty crazy. Yeah. Like how deep do you have to get into it?
I know, Sumit, you've actually had some actual real world experience with this, and that you've gone to, I think, like 2 10-day meditation retreats. Like, I don't know what was the aspect that, or what it was, the, I guess, drive that allowed you to actually go through with the process and actually do it. Oh, I don't know.
Oh, sorry. While he's getting his mic hooked up, I actually have a real life situation where I literally had the bearings of my left wheel, back wheel, off kilter, and my wheel was about to pop off at any time. And they've told me that my car is ready and they're going to close in about half an hour. So I'm going to duck out, probably not more than half an hour. I should be back in half an hour. So carry on without me, and hopefully, if you're still going, there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
I will be back.
All right. See you, Brett. Thanks.
Hello.
Yeah.
So it was the same thing. It's been happening for a while. How do I put it? So just you set out goals for yourself, but you don't actually achieve them, right? You procrastinate, and then over time it builds up, and you feel like you have no direction, right? You go anywhere where your impulses will take you. And so I was struggling with that, and that was leading to a lot of stress. And finally, somebody suggested that, hey, why don't you? And I was at that point in time, I was also not enjoying my work all that much. So somebody suggested, hey, why don't you do Vipassana meditation? And I just frankly didn't have any other options at that point in time. Right. So it's not like I was clinically depressed or anything. Just, I was feeling miserable, and I didn't know how to get out of it. So I said, okay, let's give this thing a try. And I thought I'll come out of it with, become a very productive person, have peace and all that. Right. So that's why I went there. But after I went there, they started teaching the Buddhist teachings behind what we were doing, and I realized, okay, so it's not just about being productive or controlling your stress. They have this whole system of how to live your life so that you can end the suffering once and for all, right? And they also had a lot of metaphysical ideas behind it. They totally believe in cycle of life and death and rebirth and all that, which I don't, which is problematic for me, because I want to believe that stuff, right? It's interesting, but then scientists from the West I have never seen people like Sam Harris and these other guys actually talk about that aspect. They just ignore it or push it away.
and they only discuss what they think is useful. And then I think a lot of people don't know, like, which ideas are, kind of scientifically well. It's confusing.
That's kind of like what we talked a little bit about, how Vervaeke, Vervaeke is kind of doing the same thing, that like the actual beliefs within Buddhism are kind of unnecessary to it, and like the metaphysical aspects to Buddhism. But the thing is, like in the actual, like from, like, it's easy to kind of say that from outside, but for a lot of the people within these faith structures, the beliefs are very much a part of, like, actually making sense of it. Like, you have to have this kind of actual belief in reincarnation in order to better understand the practices that are fruitful for you. Right?
Yeah, kind of the whole idea of karma was tied around what they were teaching. I didn't even understand all of that. They were saying something like the whole of your karma, your consciousness gets saved somewhere into by some process, and when you get a new body, that same thing gets reinitialized. So and I was like, I didn't know what to do about all that stuff. I mean, I wish all of it was true, and then we could have this full system. I could totally follow it. But now when I practice, I'm like, okay, I'm practicing, but is this stuff for real? Like, is there such a thing? Yeah, that happens. But back into the practice. So for the first time, I didn't understand what was going on. For the last 3 days, I was totally, like miserable because they don't let you eat that much food. You can't speak. You can't have a, in a way that was a good thing because I don't like people, so but just the whole thing is very it's not physical exercise, but mentally it's a lot to ask yourself to do that for 10 days. And for last 3 days I was just so wanted it to be over. And this one time I felt like I was in a spaceship and I was flying, and I was like, this stuff is cool, man, this is awesome. So I tell my teacher about it, that this is awesome, man, what is happening here. And a teacher says, you are just falling prey to illusion. You came here to focus on your breath, like that's what your exercise was. So you come back to it. You don't uh, fall for any sort of uh, supernatural experiences. So I was like, okay. So, and for last 3 days, my brain was just watching high definition porn in my own brain. I mean, it was it could make virtual women do anything, and that was awesome, man. So I guess I wasn't really meditating for last 3 days. I had never seen like my imagination that go that.
That is a type of meditation, Sumit. It's just producing a different product.
I didn't tell.
Listen, no, that's why it's so addicting. It's a very different flow state. It is a flow state. Those regions of your brain are very old and very good, very, very good at doing what they do, which is, keeping the game of life moving, at the very least, giving another generation the chance to do something. So the capacity to enter that flow state is probably the easiest, right? Along with a few other things that seem to be highly associated with the sanctity of life, which is something like anger and defense of the organism, right? That's another very easily accessed flow state that you can get into. Food, man, eating food, good food, you experience nothing but flow. It's like your attention goes to the mouth and the juices flowing in and all the flavors, and you're all around the tongue. Another very easily engaged flow state. all these very deep ancient systems that engage many parts of the brain and have very strong signals, it's easy to get into the flow state. So the problem, especially in the modern era, is the access to those signals which evoke those flow states are so easy. They're so prevalent. That's it. So we're essentially like, oh, great. So like imagine the Garden of Eden story, except every single thing there is the tree they shouldn't eat of. And there's one tree that they should eat of, right? That's like our modern era. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
No wonder we all fail so miserably.
Yeah, that's really interesting what both of you were just saying, because like Vervaeke, in his bringing up of addiction, he frames it as like, okay, you have your identity or your agent, and then you have your arena, and you have your agent arena relationship, like where the arena, whatever the environment is what's going to kind of prescribe what the agent is, and same for the agent is going to kind of decide which arena it's going to enter into. But when you're addicted to something, it's this reframing of your environment to only be one thing, and then from that it's going to be a transformation of yourself to be only the one thing that can fit within that environment. And then it's kind of this ultimately scaling down of, or it's not scaling down, it's like this I guess refining it in a system that is completely localized to this one particular aspect, that it is just like ultimately degrading for both the environment and the agent itself. That I found it fascinating what you were mentioning there, Sumit, how the thing that actually got you, like the thing that managed to get you to actually go to the meditation retreat was just the fact that you kind of had like no other really options available to you that you thought could really resolve the problems that you were facing. And so like, if there's nothing else there, then like, I don't know, it gives you, I guess the access to consider it as a possibility, to the point of actually like following through with it. And I wonder if it's that great span of things at our access that kind of inhibit us from actually following through with what we know we ought to. That like, if we think that like, oh, this could resolve my problem, or this could resolve my problem, or this could resolve my problem, that it gives us no real way of differentiating each of them and actually acting upon one of them in particular.
Yeah, imagine all of creation kind of phantasmagorically piled on top of itself below you, right? As like a mountainous stack that you can stand on top of. Mm-hmm. And part of what your brain does, let's say, is it's like a filter, it's a sieve for all those things and existences that only allows through certain shapes, right? As that you can kind of picture that stack of information squeezing through now the brain, like as it pushes up through it. And only those things which are interesting and relevant, let's say, manage to pop through into your awareness. And that's a fascinating process, right? Because you even if you describe it as I had no other choice and there was nothing left to do, the question is, I mean, obviously that's not true. You have a million other choices, a billion other choices. You could just go dig a hole and sleep in the ground for the rest of your life if you wanted, or open up a shop somewhere. Or, I mean, like just let the mind range. Why did it settle on these particular things that rose to the top, that were most relevant? And when you start to examine that, it's just like archaeology. It's like the thing that popped up through the surface, you start brushing away at the edges and you start trying to find out what deeper structure underneath allowed it to come forward. And when you do that, I think you get back to these essentially archetypal formulations that are related to why certain signals push through more prevalently or more frequently.
The way subjectively I understood it was in terms of being, pragmatic, in terms of like, if I have a problem with the current system and my life, right? So I would want to come up with a solution. Obviously, you can explain it in terms of biology, but I, as a consciousness, understand it subjectively, right? So the way I saw it is that I could either go to a psychiatrist and he or she will give me a bunch of pills, right? And I mean, I don't enjoy that aspect of it. And I had tried speaking to a psychologist, and I didn't. They kept asking me questions, but I really didn't feel I was being helped. That was it. So I could, leave my job, change my career, or go to woods and do all that. But you know, I guess the brain comes up with the least disruptive strategy to the current system in terms of fix it. Like the there are a lot of solutions out there, but the I guess the first solution that comes to me wouldn't be to kind of uh, wake up in a different place tomorrow morning. Does that make sense? Like how can I fix it without not completely turning my life upside down in terms of like you have to pay bills, and all that.
Yeah, and if you were to ask yourself, if you were to try to make it more concrete, so if you were to put a piece of paper in front of you and grab a pencil and then ask yourself, okay, what are the reasons that I chose this, or why wouldn't this particular solution work? What you're asking your brain to do is summon forth these weird localized little things called words that relate to like a whole series of narratives, like importance of family and localization in one spot, right? That's a thing that you can create with words as a series of symbols that actualize this whole unique weird structure underneath regarding values and biological functions and all of that, right? And that's a very useful process to go through. It gives it a handle to manipulate. Whereas if you don't go through this process of actualizing something, it feels far less tangible. It's series of images stacked on top of each other like ghosts, right? They're hard to manipulate. But when you go through this process of logos, right, of ordering something into a word, you give it a handle. You give it something that you can manipulate. Now, there's both a great power in this and a great danger, because the handle is attached to an extraordinarily complex, deep, and rich and complicated structure, right? It's just neural. And then, in the sense that it's metaphysically extended beyond all the things that created that neural structure, even beyond. So you can...
Are you saying I can program my brain by being more articulate about what the issue is, and then try to have a conversation? I can do that.
Mm-hmm. So I think most people describe this interesting process where they have a problem in their life, and then someone comes along and says, "Oh, you're just OCD," and they say the word or the acronym OCD, and that right there is an ordering principle, and they say, "Oh my gosh, all these behaviors, all these things," that it suddenly makes sense. It attaches to this word, right? And then they use that word to go and look for more information about OCD, and they learn about it. And their memory is it's like a locator function. OCD points to, boom, explosion of knowledge, right? It's this little focal point that then expands into an extraordinary library and capacity of information that they've researched and developed. And that is the same process that we're always going through, I think, is we have this very nebulous, hard to grasp concept. And the moment that we move over towards Broca's area, left hemisphere, right over by the grasping region, in the motor cortex, this is McGilchrist's work, right? Once we get it back over here, we have the capacity to use it like a tool, which touches those parts of the neural structure on the right, which are those elements in the world that are encoded by that. So yes, you can reprogram all those incredible webs of behavior associated within you by finding the handles that can organize them, and then learning how to use those handles, those words, to discover new interesting concepts about it. It's okay. It's almost like you're fishing. Imagine you are sitting on a lake and you have a fishing pole, right? And fishing for a fish in the lake is very similar to seeking for a word in your mind. You're just casting down and you're like, okay, what's the proper word for that? And you tug on it a little bit. And if it's a really light tug, like, oh, no, that's not the right word, right? That's not it. No, this is a much bigger word. This is a longer word, right? You have weird senses like that. No, it starts with a certain letter. And that's related to how we maybe sequence our memories, right? Or how we pull up those patterns, or how we organize those memories. But okay, or maybe it's not, maybe it's like it's a 10-letter word. So you're like, oh, that it's not a short word, it's a long word. So you're sensing like this tug on something. And what I'm saying is, depending on how you build your fishing pole, like how sensitive it is to bending, you have the capacity to do a lot more sensing of what you're tugging on, right? You can increase your capacity to determine what you're casting into and what you're pulling on based on other tools that other side of the brain uses. And that's like using a GPS fish finder and carbon fiber pole that allows you to like get the really nuanced changes in the tension on the string. And then you start to discover that you can use like nylon string and like Teflon, like all sorts of weird string types. And this is analogous to going through this process of learning new psychotechnologies, new behavioral modes. And I think it's primarily related in this conversational aspect, right? Because we're all engaged in the words right now. Words. So you can engage into that deep ocean of experience over here with far more fidelity and capacity by increasing your word usage, so to speak. Reprogram. Yeah.
What about, okay, I'll ask that question after I finish the second retreat one. So the second time I went there, right? So second time was much better. So they basically taught me to, it sounds so simple. So whenever some impulse comes, you just step back and observe whatever is happening in your body, your mind. So let's say I'll think about a particular person, right? And the moment I think about that person, a series of emotions will come up, right? And I would just observe that, not participate in it. And I did that for 5-6 times. And the reason they teach you this is that, let me put it this way. Let's say you are angry at someone. So every time you think about this person, you just punch the wall because you are so angry, right? And it's your compulsion or whatever. So so when that emotion came, I just observed it. I just said, okay, right now I'm angry. I accept that I'm angry, and yes, I want to punch the wall. And you totally, completely, just you are not angry at the fact that you are angry. You just are angry. That's it. Right now I'm angry. I just okay. That's it. I just watch the anger, whatever it means. And I did that 5-6 times, right? And after that, what happened was that exactly as they were telling me that, the association between that person and that anger kind of broke down. So next time I thought about that person, I might as well be smiling, because whenever that input came to my brain, I actually didn't do anything. I just was in the observer mode, and eventually nothing happened. So that was cool. That was the one thing that happened that taught me to kind of move away from negative, stuff. It's interesting that works. So that I remember that I learned that, and the second time I was able to meditate much better. apart from that, I didn't have any other significant insight. The question for Tyler was that what about the brain that doesn't have words? Right. There's also.
Yeah. So this is why I'm so I guess aware of it, perhaps, is because my brain doesn't really like to use words. And so I've developed a bit of alteration on the technique, perhaps. But it's nevertheless attempting to accomplish the same process, which is it's a reliable interrupt technique that lets you keep bringing in new information and reformulating things in new ways so that you're not stuck in any one framework. And that's the power that giving all of these complex ideas word handles allows you, is that you can dig deeper if you start to develop a greater sense to use more words. But it can also just let you cycle things superficially, right? Every one of us knows somebody who uses big words or big concepts superficially. They just throw the word out there. They refer to it. But if you were to ask them about it, it's undoubtedly there's no connection, no deeper actual structure related to it. So, but this is important. Okay, so to use coding language that may be a little more familiar, you have, so certain languages will have like cycles, right? So you'll have like clock cycles that perform a certain number of operations, right? And then it will move to the next cycle. And our brains work that same way as the patterns flow through all the weird little pipes. They get stuck in these little loops. And you can see it's doing it so remarkably fast, but it's just it's spinning off little circles, right? And it's timing those things so that the associations of those timings through this kind of central pipeline of our singular awareness is how we end up determining the relevance of these things. So you have to know when to interrupt the cycle. I guess that's my point. You have to know when to interrupt the cycle. And I think that's the deeper point than just knowing how to manipulate the words or having the words themselves. You have to know when and where to interrupt the cycle of behaviors, right? The cycle of ways in which you are engaging in the world. You have to recognize that something bad is occurring, right? And then be able to interrupt it at the proper place. Like that's the key element, because you can imagine, if you imagine all those streams, right, as they meet back in the middle to your conscious awareness, where you manipulate them and then try to determine where they go. What that meditative technique was teaching you before was to divert, like when it comes back around, to kind of divert the anger stream, right? To let it go off on its own way. And if you do that enough, like if you let the signals spin out and it takes its own path in a different direction, just like water erosion, right? It makes a new path, and that's where it will prefer to go in mental association. So that's what I was thinking about when you're.
Gotcha.
Sorry, I'm coming back in midstream, but when you were saying, but I think I got the gist of what you were just saying. But are you saying that? So I get that we want to disrupt those negative patterns, but you seem to indicate that there's a right time and a wrong time to disrupt. Is that what you were saying? Or
yeah. So if you have like a 5-step process, right? Imagine that. I mean, you can interrupt. Let's say you're capable, and it's not always that you can interrupt any of them. Like so. That's interesting.
Like, is there a bad time to just stop and reassess? The sense I got from Vervaeke though is that sort of anytime you do this, you're going to be helping yourself have a better chance at an insight.
T-Rex chasing you down. Stop and reassess.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I mean, right. Okay. I get it. I was thinking more just in terms of thinking about a problem, but you're just saying there are practical times where you really, I mean, the thing is, running away from a T-Rex isn't a process you want to disrupt, right?
Right.
You know, it's when you're running away from the metaphorical T-Rex, when there's really no T-Rex, but your mind, your fight, flight, you know, and freeze instincts are still engaged when it's just worrying about an assignment coming up or worrying about, you know.
Yeah, that actually brings up another really interesting point, because sometimes it's not the interrupt of the cycles. Sometimes the cycle was interrupted and it created a short-circuited loop, and the cycle was never allowed to complete. I think PTSD is this. PTSD is when the cycle gets stuck in a particular niche, and the cycle of grief or exposure in the proper amount of fear and anxiety allows the person to take care of the issue. So sometimes it's because you have to get back in that frame, and instead of getting stuck in, say, like fear and anxiety, you have to push forward into resolution. So you have to successfully escape the T-Rex that's chasing you, right? You have to get to a safe spot and then go, oh, wow, it didn't get me. I'm okay. Because I think PTSD is getting stuck mid-run from the T-Rex and never cognitively being able to get past that memory, even if you did escape the T-Rex.
Well, I think you noted it. The time to interrupt is when you notice that you're stuck in the loop. The time to employ the disruptive practice, not just, okay, so there's just the general disruptive practice of meditation, which you just want to do every day. But if you have a particular problem and you're ruminating or stuck in, like Vervaeke, I clipped it, John, like he had the cycle of depression. When you recognize you're in one of these cycles, that can be the time to say, okay, let's deliberately employ one of these disruptive practices. I think that's what cognitive behavioral therapy is. You know, it's forcing you to disrupt the loop that you get into in these cognitive distortions that someone can get, whether it's, you know, fear of heights or just general anxiety. So cognitive behavioral therapy will say, stop, consciously assess what are you worried about? How do you feel about it? How reasonable is your fear? Could it be otherwise? And that is a disruptive practice. And
that's like actually kind of doing the thing that Sumit talked about of going into observer mode rather than being in relation to the thing. Because as Vervaeke brings in, like when we have a negative experience that happens to us, we're automatically going to be in that kind of like angry or sad or repressed state that is going to cloud the way that we observe all other situations. Like when we're sad, we can't remember all the times that we were happy to the same degree of fidelity. Than we can with other sad situations. That's very similar to like when we're in a room, we're better at remembering the things that we learned in that room. It's the same for like our emotional states. And so when you can kind of get that ability to step outside yourself in a way and observe your experience from a sort of third person objective perspective, that gives us the ability to consider how to respond to this in a way that's not directly tied in this kind of spiraling downward feedback cycle of making things worse, or the wheel that's off of its axle.
Did you discuss that when I was out in more detail, the what you just said, where when you're sad you remember the things that are sad more often?
Not exactly, no.
So that was fascinating, and it explains so much about, I mean, I have my history of depression and anxiety, so it really rang true, where when you're sad, again, the heuristic is, it is easier for you, it's a physical capability, it's literally easier for you to remember all the other times when you were sad, and harder for you to remember all the times when you weren't sad. Now, this is, in a way, it's a cognitive distortion, but it's not bad thinking. It's not like you're doing something wrong. This is a natural process that is just baked into the way we think, and it explains why we get stuck in these ruts. When I've had depression. I have depression, but not that I'm always down. But when you're down, all you do, it just seems that everything is down and it's never going to end. It's not true. but it's not just that but it makes it's more normal. It's more natural. It's not that you're doing something quote unquote wrong. It's just your brain automatically has this bias towards remembering these things. And then I guess the idea is to disrupt that. But that's fascinating. Like when he talked about anxiety, that what happens when you're anxious is you literally lose your cognitive flexibility. That it's a physical process, that brain process that's going around when you're anxious is doing something, which is why when you get into an anxious state, you can get really just locked, where you can't see a way out. But it's not, I think there's a real cognitive mapped out function that's going on there, which I hope, I think in a way it's depressing because you think, oh, well, I'm just stuck with it. But, it tells us, no, it's understood why it happens and that it happens. And again, that there may be a way out, that you can disrupt these loops we get into and become, so Vervaeke, and this is, I think, the brilliance of this episode, he says, all these negative loops serve to restrict our world, restrict our options, restrict our sense of our identity and what we can be. But there are other technology which can help broaden them out, which we've talked about over the last number of weeks, that can help, that can scale back up and, help you see the options that you weren't seeing when you were anxious. And to me, that's very attractive because, again, I have my issues of anxiety, like everything he said in this episode. And anybody who suffers from depression, anxiety, or addiction, really go out and watch this episode, because it will help you at the very least understand the processes that you'll probably hit you very familiar with.
Yeah. His last 20 minutes on addiction, it was the most incredible things, and I want to get into that into better detail. But I do want to ask Susan. I know we've kind of been like completely monopolizing the conversation here. Is there, I don't know, some do you have any particular I guess thoughts on Buddhism in general, or some of the things discussed in this lecture maybe?
I have my headphones on, so I hope this is better.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Gosh. Lots of things. I'm really mainly listening. I was wondering, has anyone else been in any of the military services, like gone through basic training or boot camp?
No.
That kind of reminds me of, I was trying to think if Vervaeke had gone into, he mentioned disruptive techniques briefly, fasting, different things like that. Mm-hmm. So I was trying to think, I don't think he's gone into how to do them on a regular basis yet, has he?
No, not really. At least
he's talked about it more generally, that there are these practices, like if you meditate regularly, if you do a contemplative practice regularly. But see, really, I think he's very wary of it, because he's always cautioning, don't just do it on your own. You should do it within a community that's dedicated to this. So I think I'm getting the sense he's wary of just prescribing stuff, that I think he thinks there's a danger to just doing it on your own without guidance.
Yeah. Did any of you, myself being a Christian, get the sense that he was maybe proselytizing a little bit, but then not proselytizing his worldview, and but also, like you guys are talking in the very beginning, that he really he does not have a there's definitely not a God. He's definitely stuck in a physical realm, mm-hmm. Which, like you guys were saying, you don't know how he can get through all this and not come to God,
Yeah, Tyler was mentioned that before the stream.
Yeah, right.
Not all of us agree with that, but we can get into that.
Yeah, that's something I was noticing even more particularly in this lecture, that the language that Vervaeke has access to in order to discuss these problems are centered within kind of a subjectivist framework where meaning is made or created, like, and it's done in relation to the subjects and their environments, but it's not like in reference to anything external in a sense that like
he rejects the dual view, the dual world
Cartesian.
Yeah. Well, yeah, not even just in regards to metaphysics, but like, okay, so his framing of philosophy is based around psychotechnology, where these are tools that we're creating, that we're using in our lives. It's not like philosophy is giving us any sort of better understanding of truth. Like, it is kind of rejecting the idea that truth can exist outside of minds that are, I guess, inhabited by it, or yeah, I guess you could say it's something like that. These are all built from the ground up in a way, and I guess Peterson kind of follows that same pathway with like kind of his idea of Darwinian truth and other things like that, but I think Peterson, in like where him and Vervaeke kind of disagree, would say that there are certain implications that you can get based upon how the world works that could lead you to infer something metaphysical to the process. Whereas Vervaeke thinks that, at least from my understanding, that no such inference is really required.
Right. Well, I think what he did, I think he sees religion, all the various religions, as psychotechnologies to help, garner the sense of meaning. So I think he respects the myths that are used, but he just thinks they're describing something else. He doesn't think they're describing an actual spiritual world, an actual God, but he thinks they are a great metaphor for helping people, everything that we've talked about, this, disruptive, that they are disruptive technologies, and that the practice of religion at its essence is designed to help people achieve this meaning. And that I think what he's noticed, and what I've noticed too, is like, I think, when you look at the discussions that a lot of us have on Twitter and all that about, the atheist, theist discussions, a lot of it is really geared at the beliefs. So, is this or that belief true? Is there a God? Did Jesus exist? Did he perform miracles? And all of that. But very little of it, at least that I've seen, focuses on what does religion do for people beyond the mere beliefs. What role does it play in their lives? How does it help or harm them in a more in a more, again, in the being sense? And I think that's what he's talking about, this crisis of the West, that a lot of us, have just focused on, the details, but I think he thinks it's missing the point of really why religion has grown and why it's so useful to us.
Yeah, Sumit mentioned something, a bit of that while you're gone, but it's funny because just yesterday I had a discussion with Job from the Paul Vanderklay community that was kind of discussing directly this in relation to Christianity, where like asking whether or not there's a way in which you can be a Christian without adopting the exact belief processes, but still accepting, I guess, like the practices and things like that. But the thing that Sumit brought up was that during his meditation retreats, they very much utilize the, I guess, metaphorical language that Vervaeke would refer to it as, in order to kind of support the meditation practices themselves. Like, we kind of have this idea within the West that you can have one without the other. And I think that's the person that I was mainly referencing, of like religion beyond belief or something like that in regards, or maybe Buddhism.
Stephen Batchelor.
Right. Stephen Batchelor. Thanks. That you can disregard all the metaphysics of Buddhism, but still adopt the meditative practices and benefit from it. So like you can have this, like, I guess, refined version of Buddhism without any of the adoption of ancient principles or ancient belief systems, things like that. But I don't know if it's supported. I mean, I guess I could read his book to really get a feel for it. But I mean, if the very structure that allows for these beneficial meditative practices are all kind of supported by the metaphorical language of reincarnation and karma and all these other things, then can we really say that you can have one without the other in sort of the way that it seems like Vervaeke is trying to build up?
Well, I think I think they're tools, and these metaphors help a person grip it, right? So it's just a different way of saying it. Like, again, I bring it back to, even Peterson's clean your room. It's not about cleaning your room. It's about engaging in a practice of organizing yourself so that you getting things in order, so that you start off close to you, and then hopefully what happens if you branch out. So it's a trick, so to speak, not a bad trick, but it's a way to get into a practice that will
it's something that Vervaeke brings up in his lectures on Aristotle, of the cultivating this virtue of like becoming more capable of cleaning your room gives you the better ability to become more capable of cleaning your workplace or something like that.
I just have to interject. I got to step away because I got to go look at my children's room. They're cleaning it right now. And he just came down and said, "Come look at my room." While you were saying it's hilarious.
That's fun.
That's good. And earlier, they had just called to tell me my car was fixed for literally the problem of my rear wheel not sitting properly on its axle, and with a risk of popping off. And you just came in with that metaphor. So
oh man, two synchronicities in the same conversation. Wow.
Oh my God, God is real. No, but that's the point. I think the usefulness of these religions when they're working the best is that these stories do help us do that. But it doesn't mean you have to use those stories, but you probably have to have some sort of help, whether it's regardless of, I think what he's doing here in this lecture series is giving a secular version to help people get into these routines. So it's, the fact is there's so many religions. This helps to me, and it was too bad Tyler just walked away, but this helps. I mean, I'm a secular, I'm not a religious believer. I mean, I'm open to it, but I'm not convinced. But to me, it helps explain why there are so many religions, but because they each provide a similar role. They have different mythologies, but they provide a similar role to their communities with, varying differences. But that's what they do. And that helps explain why they developed that, because we have a brain that for whatever reason we evolved this way, produces these type of feelings, and we have these type of loops, and these that help us but also hurt us. And the religions have come in to figure out ways to help gear towards the helpful loops and avoid the unhelpful loops. So I think that is why I think you can use this to help get away from God, because it helps to say, well, I mean, it's not that we have all these religions because there's a God at the base of it. It's that we have all these religions because we have a certain biology that produces a certain type of thinking that has pros and cons, and disruptive practices such as hallucinations, taking drugs and so on, can help develop technologies to help the bad stuff and help promote the good stuff. And so they've just developed in different parts of the world different stories to help do this. Because remember, we have so much to do these days, but back then there wasn't entertainment, so they had a lot more time to contemplate all of this, right? So it makes sense that they could get these deep insights because they had so much time just to focus on all of this without a lot of the distractions we have today.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Sumit. Yeah, I can wait.
The thing about Buddhism is that it's not like other religions in terms of Jesus Christ did this, or if you believe in him, you will go to heaven or anything like that. In Hinduism, we have all kinds of things that you are supposed to do, worship and all that. It's for example, I just pulled out a book on Buddhism that I got from that facility, right? So it talks about 54 kinds of mental phenomena. Then it divides the consciousness into 6 classes, right? And then it's very detailed. So it defines 14 immoral properties like greed, hate, dullness, error, conceit, envy, selfishness, worries, and for example, over here it says 25 morals: interestedness, amity, reason, faith, mindfulness, modesty, discretion, balance of mind, composure of mental properties, composure of mind. It goes on and on and on. So it's very well detailed, and most of it I don't even understand because it's not explained in terms of the way a layman may understand. It's translated, but I guess I'll have to read it so many times just to understand what's going on. So I guess my main point is that it's more like written like a textbook or some kind of science, and you don't know where metaphysics starts or where this kind of scientific stuff ends. I'm only saying scientific because not because I am saying they follow the scientific method, but the way they have categorized these things, the way they have explained it, the way they have reasoned it out, it might be, I can't say it's wrong or right, but I guess what I'm trying to say is when I hear like that, even over here, they don't talk about any of this stuff that is written in this book. So I guess what I'm saying is you have to study Buddhism more and then make your own mind. So most of the time, I don't think we even know that what we are dropping. So when you say he will explain Buddhism or these practices to us in a scientific manner, right? So we haven't really explored all of it on our own to know that, oh, these are all, just beliefs, and we can just should just drop them and just follow the practices. But all these literature that surrounds, these practices, we don't even know what it is. So right now, I'm not a big fan of it. Like it's like saying Bible is, full of shit before actually reading it. If you have read it and none of those stories make any sense to you, where somebody eats some fish eats some man and someone is walking on water and someone is offering virgins or something like that. All those things people criticize Christianity for, right? So so you have to read these first, because so far what I have read, I haven't encountered any metaphysics yet.
In what? Sorry, in Buddhism or so far have you read it?
Okay, so okay. Let me put it this way: I encountered a lot of metaphysics, I can say, when they were teaching at the meditation classes. But the book I got from that, I started reading it last week, and so far I haven't encountered any kind of metaphysics because it's all talking about mind, consciousness, then dividing the properties of mind in multiple categories, and then categorizing the various properties of the consciousness, and some properties are universal, and then some are not, and all that stuff.
So then, do you think that maybe Vervaeke is kind of right, in or Brett's right, that the ideas of, say, like karma and reincarnation are only kind of utilized as metaphors to help the people that are first kind of getting into it, to give them kind of the idea of what the I guess the mythology associated with Buddhism, like any religion or framework needs to have kind of a mythology.
They may not. They may believe it though. Like the people who came up with it may believe it, but I think it has a certain function. The reason why they come up with it and why it sticks with them and why it's so powerful is because it does these other things. But so do other cultures. They have similar but competing, and they can't all be true, but they all provide certain roles in society, like without question, right? And each culture will say it feels real and feels right, but maybe it's because what it's doing is keying into these processes.
But over here, it's not like I have read Hindu text somewhat. I have read the New Testament also. But this is unlike anything else.
Right.
Because their metaphysics mixed with these not scientific, but how do I put it?
Yeah, very strict
logical argument, right, on something. So, for example, it says here consciousness is divided into 6 classes: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and then it goes down. The mind consciousness is again subdivided into 4 kinds: kama consciousness, rupa consciousness, arupa consciousness, lokutra consciousness. Of these, kama consciousness is that which lies within the jurisdiction of desire prevailing in the kama loka. It is again fourfold: moral, immoral, resultant, ineffective. Rupa consciousness is ascetic mind which has become free from kama desire but still remains within the jurisdiction of desire prevailing in the rupa loka. I mean, it sounds more like the way my science textbooks used to read, where you classify things into different properties, then you have subdivisions, and later on, if they start talking about soul transmigrating from this level to that level, then I will say, okay, so that sounds like metaphysics, but it's all mixed up in this other stuff, which kind of makes sense. So it is so confusing.
Well, that's the thing too. For a lot of the faiths, there are these kind of like reasoned and rational ways of understanding the mythology in association with like what we know. Like Thomas Aquinas kind of used Aristotle's philosophy in order to kind of build a strong foundation of understanding for the Catholic Church, and like using most of the same principles from Aristotle and fitting them within a Christian worldview. And like the same kind of thing happens within Judaism as well. Like I think Maimonides did a similar thing with Aristotle's work, and also, the Arabs in using Aristotle for their for Islam. There's a lot to, like, there's always going to be this kind of like the more rational, reasoned approach to these things, and then so that I guess they fit within the same perspective. Like if you have a certain mythological worldview, then from there you can build a lot of the reasoned and rational basis of our observations so that it fits within that worldview. Or maybe the other way around as well. Maybe. I'm not so sure about that though.
Well, I mean, you can look at what these look like. Okay, God's promise, God's covenant in the Old Testament. You know, it's about making promises and keeping promises. You know, there's a very real moral practice that's being encouraged there. You should keep your promises, or even the concept of sin. Focusing on sin is a disruptive practice. You're focusing on your behavior and its impact. I mean, they frame it often dogmatically, but it is really saying stop and think about what you're doing. Even like confession, what's it doing? Stop and think about the bad things you've done. That's a disruptive practice. It has a function. I think it helps control society. You have people confessing all their sins, to the rulers. There's a cynical side to it, but it's in a very real way. Think about prayer. I think there's a lot of overlap between prayer and meditation. I think prayer probably, for people who do it, who don't just maybe like the 3-second prayer doesn't do much, but the people who sit and pray, my guess is it's performing a very similar role to meditation and what it's doing in your brain. So it's not that each of these religions are going to be exact. They're all exactly going to figure out. I think Buddhism, is a much more practical. I think the Buddha was much more focused on practice than the metaphysics, although it came out of Hinduism, which has a whole lot of, his background would have been Hindu, right? So Hinduism he didn't focus on the metaphysics, but a lot of people around him, spent a lot of time on the metaphysics. So, Hinduism has just as in depth, if not more, than the Christian version, right? So I think it does help explain. Again, this is why I think it helps lead towards saying. It's why I don't think it necessarily leads you back to God, because there's another approach that to me makes just as much sense, which is that we have a biology that leads to certain experiences that we tend to interpret in certain ways, and it comes out in the form of metaphor almost. I mean, even as we're doing it now, because we're trying to get a grip, right? You're trying to get an optimal grip, and metaphor and analogy is super helpful to explaining things. Why do we use analogies and metaphors? To help explain, to help get it, to grasp it.
I don't think they are using it as an analogy. Whatever my experience have with them, maybe they have to pretend to believe it so that it will have an impact on others. But
no, but they probably do believe it. They probably, it's not that they're cynical. It's that they believe it, but it's doing something that they may not fully recognize. They may not fully, I doubt it that they just sat down, although from what I understand, even especially the early Old Testament, it wasn't meant as literal history. I mean, to some extent they were aware, I think, that they were, it was very common practice in those days to assign miracles to great figures because you wanted to, put focus on the things that they did. So maybe to some extent, but it's not the same as fiction. And they believe it in a different way. It's their relationship between themselves and their God and whatnot. It's framed as the relationship. It's framed as an interaction. I think there's an overlap, and I think it opens up.
So I don't know. At least this, I think, raises a maybe concern or question for Vervaeke's project here, in that he's kind of like bringing the Western world to better understand Buddhism. Like, he himself is a Buddhist teacher, I believe, and he's prescribing it in this, if you could consider it prescribing. I guess there's a sense of him prescribing it, since this is in reference to the meaning crisis, that people adopt these kinds of practices to help them in understanding where they are in life. Like, what is the frame that is for them, that they can understand for themselves? Because that's the thing, like, you can't just universally apply the same frame onto every individual person, but giving them the tools that they can have to understand who they are and what they're supposed to be doing. What is their meaning, their purpose for living? So he's giving them this tool, but if he, along with it, he's recommending actually applying yourself to if he's recommending people also seek out those with actual understanding, expertise in the practices, and all the people that have these expertise in the practices believe it in a doxastic way, like they actually believe it to be true rather than believing it as simply metaphor. or analogy, then is he kind of shooting himself in the foot and creating a secular religion there? If everybody that
I think part of what he wants is like, and part of what he's trying to do and why he teaches himself, and Stephen Batchelor again is well known as a secular, there are, I know there are a bunch of people who are sort of focusing on meditative practices more secularly,
right?
And they still talk about loving kindness. They still talk about, all the stuff. So I think what he's advocating is that we develop these institutions in modern day, in the modern world, to help fill in, and maybe have it without. I think he would probably want it without the baggage, but I think he's willing to accept the baggage of some of those teachers because they still, whether they have the baggage or not, they still, they can still do a good job of getting you to properly do these.
Yeah, so this will be interesting. It almost like raises a, I guess, predictive analysis that we can have for Vervaeke's project, in that, like, he's of the opinion that these, like, the meaning crisis can be resolved without the acceptance of these metaphorical truths in a literal sense or in a typical sense. And yeah, I guess that'll be something that can be tested somehow.
Maybe what one could say is, if you don't appreciate these metaphors in sort of their useful sense, then you're probably not grasping these concepts, because these metaphors are very useful. Like the idea of heaven and hell. Like, I've always thought, I don't know, always, but the last few years thought the idea of hell is much more useful to me, not as a place where you go when you die, but to talk about that sense of suffering, that being stuck, that you can be in hell. And I think it's an incredibly useful metaphor to say, you can be in hell now. You can be living in hell. I think I've experienced that. And that there's a way out of it, which is why I think where Christianity has sort of gone off is they portray hell as the thing that happens after and there's no escape. I think they missed the boat there where I think that can be a little negative because then you really are stuck and you can never get out of it. But
like Peterson's almost secular version of hell, or rearticulation of understanding hell, is like very much tied to his self-authoring program, where you write out what is the thing that is keeping you from achieving your goals, and what is this thing that, like, what would the future look like in 5 years if all of the worst aspects of yourself had control over you and continued the cycle? Like, what would that do to you as a person? And, like, you can really, like, connect who you, like, the limits of your own capacities as you are right now to the consequences to that going forward. And, like, it's very, just like you were saying, it's a very useful way of thinking about this, so that you can, like, see things from, I guess, the kind of that third person observer perspective, and be able to hopefully change your way of acting in the world.
Like when you stop and think, oh my God, I'm in hell.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be. And I can talk from depression. Sometimes you're in hell and you embrace it. Like, you hear a lot of Christians say, well, atheists want hell. What? I don't think that's a thing, but I think there is sometimes when you're feeling depressed, you embrace the suffering, sort of. And that's sort of a version of wanting to be in hell. But it's a negative wanting. Like it's a distortion. It's not a helpful thing. You want to break out of that, but when you're in it, it's really hard to break out of that concept. Like you just embrace it. And you almost, I think of it just like closing your eyes and letting the waves take you away. And that's exactly what he's talking about, suffering, where you feel that loss of agency. And sometimes when you're depressed, you just want to give up completely because you feel you don't have that agency. I mean, that's like, this is where it's all, I think, brilliant that it gives, I think it opens the way to have a better appreciation for what religion is doing. Even like, that's why I'm not an anti-theist, even though I'm not a believer. I think religion, while it has a lot of negative sides, I think it does a lot of positive things too. And this is part of it. And I think we would all benefit from sort of really recognizing that and just saying, oh, it's all bad is just as unreasonable as saying it's all good.
Susan, did you want to add anything to this or raise any questions?
Did when did anyone think about, as you're talking about, it sounds like he's coming up with Vervaeke is coming up with a secular religion. It made me think of what Paul Vanderklay's videos on the Brett Weinstein debate, and he says, "Oh, he just wants his own religion." You know, that's what he wants. You know, did you watch that? With the Alistair?
Yeah, on the Unbelievable channel,
Right.
Alistair McGrath had a debate with Brett Weinstein, who is kind of the Vervaekean kind of understanding that, but primarily from an evolutionary perspective, that religion has a evolutionary purpose within it that has allowed.
And now we're stuck, and it's not going to help us anymore.
Yeah.
We need a new religion, but he won't use the word religion.
Yeah. I don't know if Brett's like really interested in having a secular religion, but he's wanting. I would say he's probably wanting the the benefits that, like, all the social components and structural components that religions provide without the necessity of believing in BS. I think that's some sort of phrasing of Sam Harris.
I'm a non-believer, and I think there are some downsides to religion, but I would never want to just get rid of religion without some institutions ready, set up to take their place, because there is no question religion do a whole lot of things that are really important in society, and I just getting rid of it.
This is where I think a lot of the confusion comes in. Actually, this is the way you just use the language there. Religions actually don't do anything.
I'm using do, and I mean, it's a little bit metaphorical, but
I know, but I think that actually that process is very natural, right? It's how we kind of localize nouns and verbs and how they works in our language, right? But that process is what starts to create these kinds of tensions and understandings, right? So you can examine the process or the question now. What do religions do? Should we allow them to continue, right? That's part of what's at stake when you have people like Sam Harris discussing this. So religions don't do anything. People do things. And so if you ever discuss getting rid of religions, it's getting rid of people. Okay, that's the only, it is the only, you have to either get rid of the people or fundamentally change, their internal makeup to become new people. And that's been the wholly, I think, important aspect of all of the religious battles that have occurred in the world, that there is this really deep desire to eradicate some other fundamentally different belief from ours. It's very common, like it's very, very common. And it exists just as frequently in the atheists.
I guess I'm not sure that's what it is, because of the way I see it. And I think this comes out of, I think Vervaeke has reached a similar conclusion, is when I say these religions are doing something, it's that they are providing a system that's reinforced, that has a community where they practice a system of practice that has very real world effects. It's a system to help us. It's a psychotechnology that has certain effects. And the only way psychotechnologies work is if you do a psychotechnology once, it's not likely to do much for you. You've got to do psychotechnologies over and over again. And that's what the research is showing too. And that's what I think he sees, and I think I see too, religion as. So yeah, you can say, yes, it's people that do things. Yeah, but this is a framework that helps people do things. It helps teach people how to do it. It helps keep them going. So that's, I think, what we mean when we say, what is religion doing? And by getting rid of religion, you're not saying get rid of all the good stuff. You're just saying get rid of that framework and replace it with a different framework.
Yeah. Well, that's the okay. So how does that process occur though? Because it's always occurring. Right. No current religion that exists right now. Well, maybe there's a few, but try to hold on. Right. But no current religion is the same as it was millennia or even a few decades ago sometimes. Right. There are massive changes that occur in liturgy and ritual and even core doctrines. Right. You can have schisms, and you can have reformations, all sorts of crazy stuff going on in your religions.
But there's still, it's an evolve. So, I mean, I think we can say it's an evolving system, right? But, yeah. I think it is, I don't know. I guess I think it's a fair use of language to say, what does religions do? Like what we're saying, what is the practical effect of this system? And I think we can say there are positive aspects to religion and there are negative aspects. I think I think like the hardcore, anti-theists, I think they're right with a lot of the things that they dislike about religion, but they're missing a lot of the good things. And so they throw the baby out with the bathwater. And because I don't think they appreciate it. And frankly, I don't think I appreciate it either. Like, even though he's not really talking much about Christianity and all those other types of things, this lecture series has made me appreciate the function of religion more, because it's made, I mean, he said briefly that all the major religions have some of these experiences at their heart, that way back when, I mean, especially, like the shamans and whatnot, even there's some research, I think, that shows that even Christianity had a psychedelic root way back when, that psychedelics have played a part in all these religions. And so they do these things. Now you're right. I think we need if we were to get
dreams are psychedelics, by the way.
No, yes, I know, I agree, but I think that's exactly the point. It's about using these sort of chemicals to help induce a dreamlike effect, but even more intense, on purpose. But to that, if we were to say, quote unquote, get rid of religion, it's not getting rid of the people, it's getting rid of the system. But if you don't have a system to put in its place, then you're going to be in big trouble. Now everything's, have I frozen or is Tyler just frozen? Okay, no, Tyler's back. Okay, great. I didn't know if I was going.
Yeah, I'm just, kids.
I mean, are you more comfortable with the language of get rid of the system rather than like, what does the system do, or what is the effect of following the system? Does that?
Well, so the nuance, I think, comes in when you try to analyze from the different levels, right? When you really ask the question. So if I ask the question, what are religions doing, right? What level do I look at it? So if I'm a practicing Catholic today, what amount of influence do the core Catholic doctrines have on my behaviors in the real world? What amount of influence, what amount of structure did catechism produce within my mind that I rely upon in order to make my bills paid on time, or to get along with Nancy in the cubicle next door because she keeps putting on that damn perfume, right? Like, what level are we engaged with the stuff that we know, right?
And this is what Vervaeke's talking about, scaling up and scaling down.
Right. Yes. So I'm like I've told you before, man, I'm right on board with all of his conclusions and the development of the argument of his thought, every bit of it, except for where we end up with the no God thing, and that's only a personal belief of his. So that's why I'm here, in fact, because discussing his work is wonderful. Like it's what I think each of us needs. Because if I to pull it back to my point, the truest expression of religion is what each of us lives personally in our life, combined with whatever mess somebody hands us. Okay, that's the way it works. You come into this world and you have a subjective experience. And whatever the hell you experience comes through, and you filter it and you try your damnedest to make sense of it. And layered on top of that is the gift of all of history, perhaps. Every idea that's ever been made, especially right now, because you have access to it through the internet. All of it comes to you and says, all right, you've lived a life, make sense of it with this filter. And you're like, oh, okay, that's kind of nice. And then you look over here and you see another filter and it does remarkably better. And you're like, oh, no, okay, all right. So we're in a really unique point at this time. But throughout history, it has always been that. It's the confrontation of personal subjective experience and whether or not the framework around you makes sense of it. Okay. And that's, I mean, I don't see any other way to get around it.
Right. But doesn't religion, isn't that one of the core functions of religion, which is to provide you with a sense of your place in the world?
Oh, okay, well, to refine that point, so when I think the level of analysis is wrong. That's what I mean. When people say get rid of the religion, they're talking about the wrong level of meaningfulness, right? Because if I were to wipe away the Catholic institution and doctrine, let's say, the Catholic people, and leave them all around, right? What would become of them? Well, they would just kind of gather around and make a little community and do stuff, right? But that's not what we're talking about usually. It's like in the past, it's something like converting people to a new idea, or killing them, right? That's what
but hold on. In the Vervaeke sense, like if you suddenly just got rid of Catholicism, let's just say this for the sake of argument, Catholicism is a particular psychotechnology. That practicing Catholicism, for putting aside the beliefs, has a certain practical effect. There's very real effects on your sense of meaning, or your sense of gripping the world. If you got rid of Catholicism without replacing it, you're leaving people without those psychotechnologies.
Yes.
And that will have a detrimental effect.
No, you're right. You're right. So, I wasn't trying to extrapolate all the detrimental effects of that. But
so in order to actually like complete in the goal of secularizing all the religions, you would have to have all of those differing psychotechnologies replaced, in a sense, without the need for the supernatural. And like, there's a strong question there of whether that's really possible. Like, can you have a long-standing tradition of practicing meditation without the kind of associated beliefs that what I do in the moment is going to have reincarnational karmic consequences?
Let me ask you, like, listen, the concept of hell is just as useful in the way I framed it. Like, when you're in that hell, it sucks. And yes, it's not eternal suffering, but it feels like it while you're in it. And like I think that concept of hell is very useful in terms of this whole thing. So there's no reason why.
But as soon as you're like, that's kind of the ideal, in a sense, that like if your life is suffering, then death will be the sweet release from it.
But the whole point of all this is there's another option. That there is and this is I think the main message of this episode. There is a way out. These psychotechnologies can take you out. When you are stuck in hell, you're stuck in a mental loop in certain parasitic processes. I don't know if have we brought that up yet. Parasitic processes. Yeah. So you're stuck in these parasitic processes, but there's a way out of those. And
by using the psychotechnologies.
Right. And so what I'm sort of seeing is religion is a system of psychotechnologies. And there's no reason why that religion has to have some metaphysical story.
Let me reframe that just a bit. If religion is the emergent process, right? If we're talking about the lived experience and how people behave, then religion is the series of choices that people make in their life.
Or you could call it
not necessarily, because also I have to cut in now. So this is the point that people like Bill Maher make. So there is no other psychology, this psychotechnology that is out there that actively prohibits people from logically and scientifically questioning it. And if I walked up to you and wanted to believe in some new kind of psychotechnology, you would ask for proof. You would ask for, hey, is it working for this or that? You'd ask all kind of question. You would think I'm some kind of fraud, but or you right? So, but if I walked up to you and started talking about Jesus and how he will take you to heaven and all that, so just because it is religion, it is not scrutinized as much by people, and people are born into it and they just follow it. And
it's a delivery system for these psychotechnologies.
Yeah. So if in the family I question anything, they will say these books were written by holy people or what have you. You think you know better than them and all that stuff. So there is no other new psychotechnology that we can come up with today that people will accept with this kind of restrictions, right? So that's the main point.
What you're saying is, I think it's a greater challenge to do it without religion, and I think I agree with that.
And I also want to point out that, like, just because we have the scientific process does not mean that it is as free from dogma as religions are, because there are plenty of associated dogmas to the scientific, not just the scientific method, but the scientific worldview, that if you kind of go against those, then, like, you're sort of ousted. What is the term by Thomas Kuhn, that, like, science progresses with every funeral, something like that?
Yeah.
Where,
I'm not sure. I get it. I'm not sure if I totally buy it, except that the people are biased. But the idea is it's the methodology that helps control for the bias. That bias is not, this is my take on bias. Bias is not inherently bad. It's a part of the human condition, and that it's adaptive. You know, as Vervaeke talked about, confirmation bias. We all have it. And, you know, in these internet debates, people, oh, you have confirmation bias. It's said with scorn, as if the person who's saying it doesn't have confirmation bias. We all have it, and there are reasons for it. I mean, if we always looked for, you know, if we didn't, you know, it would make it much harder to act if we were always questioning every one of our beliefs all the time. Like, at one point, you have to sort of, it would be racked with indecision. So it makes sense how confirmation bias has developed. That being said, it can work against us, but it's not a moral thing. So we use tools to overcome it. These disruptive practices. Science is a disruptive practice. It is.
What do you mean by it's not a moral thing?
It's meaning it is not immoral to have confirmation bias.
Oh, okay.
It's like, we can't help it. It's natural. What we can do is use tools, conscious tools.
Well, I would say au contraire, because lots of people treat that as morality, right? Like, whether or not confirmation bias, bad, right?
No, but that's my point. It shouldn't be. It should be. It should be seen as, like, I always say, bias is our common enemy. Like,
sort of. Okay, but this touches on this is actually my greater critique of the project that Vervaeke's working on. Okay. And it's related to this, and it's related to what Sumit was talking about with his family. If he made a critique of the book, and they would say, no, don't touch, right? And if you go to the end of the Bible in Revelation, it says, no, don't touch. And if you talk to a Protestant that believes in, like, biblical inerrancy, no, don't touch, right? And that is the conservative mindset. New tradition, no, don't touch. And there's a reason for that, okay? So to use some coding language or some computer science language, you need to have write access, right? You need to have the capacity to write new code on the human mind, because each little brain is a little computer that needs to be written onto. And I'm not saying algorithmically, but
which is kind of exactly like Brett Weinstein's point against religion, is that the code was written thousands of years ago, and we're facing problems that we're not even made aware to the people that were writing the don't touch code. Mm-hmm. And so his position, it seems, is that there needs to be a much faster mechanism for updating, I guess, our practices and our principles than what was written thousands of years ago.
What is that faster mechanism? What is it called? What's it called?
I guess science, maybe?
Intelligence. All right? It's intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Well, except one point that Vervaeke makes is, like, our intelligence system, our system that allows us to make sense of the world, can be just as used to self-deceive. So the same system that allows us to have that clarity can lead to self-deception.
Right. Well, that's it, right? So you want to limit right access because you don't just want to throw in any new tradition willy-nilly.
Right.
The only way that you should be able to compress a new tradition into the code is if it makes sense, right? And so that requires intelligence.
Yeah. So this is something that Paul Vanderklay brought up in his dialogue with Adam Friended just recently, going over the Brett Weinstein, Alistair McGrath debate, is that when you have, like, a branching of churches, you can have each church kind of working on their own thing within the larger meta structure of whatever faith that they're a part of. And they're talking with each other. They're communicating to see what sorts of new things are we applying that are actually providing useful results for us? And then able to kind of like, okay, I'm going to take that information into mind, and I might use some of it or practice some of it within my own system. And so I guess that's the point.
Who brought that up? Was that Paul?
That was Paul. That was definitely Paul. I mean, that's the thing. He's a pastor, so he knows all the inside baseball to these things that Vervaeke, Peterson, and Brett Weinstein, people like them, don't actually get to see. But
well, that's a very particular way of looking at it too, though. So yeah,
but I think it points to the necessity or the greater benefits to having this kind of larger structure that is able to intercommunicate with itself, and like from these multitudes of different positions. I mean, like I guess you kind of have a similar thing in like our judicial legal system, where like there's if one judge 5 to 10 years ago came up with a ruling for a certain thing, we're just going to apply that same ruling if it's this exact same situation.
Do you want to know? Do you want to? Okay, so it's really interesting you brought that up. But so this is what I think the meta narrative of the Earth is.
A collection of all these differing systems at play.
Mm-hmm. So in your mind, the same process is occurring. So before we were talking about the sea for reality, it's also just the sea for all thoughts that could be occurring in your subconscious. So the question is which ones rise to the front, and it's when a certain chorus of neurons produce a certain signal in just the right way that it's relevant to the kind of gap, the missing gap of wavelengths that need to pass through, let's say. But you use this weird process to coordinate these things into action, into right action with the world. Mm-hmm. But it's this weird like choral arrangement where you have to end up coordinating all of these things. That's why it's so wonderful to think of the self as an orchestrator, as a conductor of an orchestra, right? But people do the same process that's occurring in the mind with the neurons and the converging to a single word that I'm using, right? All those signals converging to a single point. In culture, it extrapolates out to the next level. So when we talk to each other, we reach for agreement, and then we unite our voices. And if we gather together in crowds, in fact, especially if we're leftists, we like to chant the same things over and over again, right? It's like, where's the slogan? Give me the slogan. I need one. I haven't spoken with, unison for the past 5 minutes. Give me a slogan. And it's exactly that process. The same thing happens when you play music with other people. It's this repeated process. So I think, right, what Paul's pointing out there, and I love that, man. It's such a beautiful insight. This is the process, okay? Things schism as the environments change, and as the unique participants and neural voices, each node being a subjective unit in religion, a person, right, who's experiencing it and then reporting to the rest around them what their experience of that religion is. Mm-hmm. So then you see these little separate organisms of religion pull off. They're each a new little species, and then they coordinate now because they are human organisms, right? They coordinate with the same language, and we're now at the point where that coordination is so rapid that you can see these rapid shifts in the shape of the cultures themselves. I mean, like women clergy, for instance, or the appointments of LGBT. Look at all these rapid shifts that occur in the formation of these things. So I think just to keep going, to extrapolate with that, right? That's what the Earth is doing. At one point, we either collapse into schizophrenia and bipolar madness, and all of us kill each other, and we die because we can't survive in the environment, or we learn to sing as one, and the proper voices merge together in this beautiful song that reaches up into single words, and like this beautiful arrangement that is humanity continuing on, surviving through. It's just, that's it.
But then there's also the other, like, it's just like the golden mean, where like you go too far in one direction and as well as for the other. If you become too dogmatic and restrained within the past history, then any new threats that come up that you're not acquainted with, you're not going to be able to provide the ability for your participants in your community to actually survive against that.
Okay, so what you guys have been saying makes me think of this, and let's see if it works out, because I'm thinking it through in real time. Religions are psychotechnologies that over time help us get a better, more optimal grip on the world. There's been there's been thousands, probably maybe hundreds of thousands of different religions. The religions that do the most effective job, that have the most effective psychotechnologies, are the ones that last. And these have developed over a long period of time. And because they do provide a real function for the people, for people who follow them, we develop a conservatism. We say, hey, a dogma. We should be very careful. We should be very reluctant to fiddle too much with this because it works, and we've proven this over a long period of time. That being said, we can also recognize that there are problems, and that's where the liberals, the progressives come in. We're saying, I hear you. There's some things that work, but there's some things that really don't work. And so that's the faction who wants to push things forward. And you need both. If you're just a liberal, if you're always just pushing everything forward, you're right. Things move too fast, and you don't have time, because you don't have time to figure out, is this a psychotechnology that really works? If you move too slow, you stagnate, and there's oppression and whatnot, because the bad things get stuck. So you need a balance. Both sides of the community are essential for a good functioning community.
So you need a rate limiter for the change, and that's based on your intelligence. That's your capacity to organize how much change is occurring in the environment and whether or not you should compress that new behavior into your system. Okay. And that's what I'm saying is, so like in our modern era right now, the reason why we're tending more towards schizophrenia and this bipolar separation that doesn't bring a synthesis, but it's more like eternal combat, is because the environment is so chaotic and so complicated and or complex that most people cannot figure out which various behaviors and ideas out in the world should be implanted in their minds. And so they've just got this schizophrenic mess inside them, and they don't know like which frame to enact in which spot. And so it's reverting to this very basic layer of like hyper moral primal kind of tribal behavior, and that's why we're seeing it.
And each side does not appreciate the value of the other side. The liberals do not appreciate the value of the conservatives, and vice versa. We need to work together. We're not enemies. Like, we can disagree and still work together. We both have points, and when we both have good points, and we both have bad points.
Maybe your conservatives are not very different from your liberals, because I mean, I'm not going to sweep it under the rug. This sounds like something HR would say, and I don't know. This seems to be the new trend. We have to work together. We have to work together in the West these days. And I mean, are you really trying to avoid conflicts here? Because for example, when I'm dealing with conservatives, right, these are the people who don't like women to have freedom, right? I'm talking about my country, and they have really dysfunctional beliefs about gender roles and all that. So, I mean, work together with these people on what? I mean, some of these people you can reason with, but a lot of them you can't. They are just
I think it's got to be a mutual. It's got to be mutual. I mean, to work, it has to be mutual. If just one side is working with the other and the other isn't, then it's just giving in to one side. Like, could you look at these people and say, listen, I don't like your views on women, but I recognize that there's something you're getting at. There's something you're looking to protect. That's not just thrown away as just sexism, that there's something useful in the system that you like, and that you don't want to lose that. You can recognize that the person doesn't want to lose something that they see in the system that is doing a good job for at least them. And that's not, and you can say, you can just throw it off as, oh, you're an evil bigot. But I think it's always more complicated than that. And the people who are liberals to say, oh, we should just accept everyone, accept everything, whatnot. That's good, but you have to recognize there are downsides to that too, and that it can cause problems that are real. That you can't just throw those away. You can't just say, well, we're just going to pretend it's none of it's there. Like, both sides have important things that they're focusing on, and sometimes they push it they only push it on that. They don't take into account the benefits of what the other side is saying. It's rare that one side just gets it 100% right.
Right. So I think I guess core element that Paul was getting during that conversation is really a good talk, even though like they hardly went through the video, is that having a shared narrative is what allows for this communication to take place. And that's kind of tied into Jonathan Haidt's work in understanding moral foundations and things like that. That if there is this shared story between the churches or the different substructures, and there's the ability to share information with each other because you're both working towards a common goal. Now, if it is the case that like the liberals think that all of the conservatives just need to not have any power and just kind of stay off into this secluded area, and vice versa, that they don't see conservatism within. I'll rephrase it as well. Conservatives don't see liberals as providing a useful resource to a society, and so by their mythology or their narrative, for like politically speaking, is that inhibit power for the liberals, and we can actually take care of business here. And so you're going to be spending a lot of time or like wasted energy, I guess, in trying to inhibit the power of the liberals, and they're going to be doing the same to you, just kind of having this standstill between each other. But by having a shared narrative or goal set, there is the ability that we can work together, even though we're of differing tribes in a way, and share information to each other in regards to benefiting that goal or fulfilling that goal, but still in keeping your own kind of cards close to your chest, in that there's a bit of a competition here where you think, like, I think that their goal is not going I think that their methodology is not going to attain that goal to a greatest extent as my methodology will attain. Like maybe there's going to be consequences to their things that they don't actually see. And so I want my system to work, but in case it doesn't, their system, it will be there in its place that I can switch over to, or I can adopt some of the principles that worked for them for our own church or community, whatever it is. Maybe that component there is the mythology of the nation or the society that's there. That's not necessarily proven from a reasonable or rational perspective.
Right. Well, let's take an example of a shared narrative that may help in this. Let's take immigration. So you have a lot of people on the right who really don't want immigration. They want to preserve their society the way it is. And you have the liberals who say there's all sorts of benefits of society. I mean, it's perhaps the shared narrative is something like we can recognize that there are some very good things for, say, an economy that immigration does. We have low birth rates in the West, so we benefit from adding to the population and so on. And it can be useful to see different cultures. But we can also recognize that when you bring people with pretty different backgrounds together, there's going to be some us versus them conflicts, because we do have these natural us versus them dynamics. And if we just pretend that that's not going to happen, or just pretend it's a character flaw in someone to have an initial sense of distrust from the other, then we're sort of ignoring an important part that we have to sort of recognize. This is going to happen. And the fact that somebody has a natural sense of distrust for the other, okay, yes, it's something I guess we want to discourage, but this is deeply based in our DNA, right? This distrust of the other, and we have to recognize it and take steps to help counter that. And that the fears that a lot of these conservatives have, to some extent, are rational. That they do see changes to their lifestyle and they don't like it, and they're afraid of losing other parts of their lifestyle. And if we don't address it, then you're missing something. And to the conservatives, the liberals to say, like if you don't realize that there are benefits from this, you're missing out as well. That there's not just downsides, there's benefits. And maybe then we can say, okay, let's recognize the benefits, let's recognize the negatives and deal with them as negative, not just say, just because it's a negative, oh my God, you're a racist. No, there are reality that it's okay to acknowledge and then maybe come up with solutions, because a lot of these things we can change and we can fix, but if we don't properly grip the problem, we're going to be coming up with the wrong solutions.
Yeah. Susan, do you have anything to add? Like, I don't know, maybe regarding your thoughts on Vervaeke's project and kind of secularizing or creating a secular religion in some sense?
Wait, just to be clear, he has not said I'm creating a secular religion. So let's not say that's his project.
Okay. So what would you say his project is? It seems like it's like at least returning the benefits that religions have served in the past without the added
baggage.
Yeah. And the beliefs, like, I guess, literal beliefs in a sense to
no, I mean, no doubt
mythology.
He's trying to capture secularly some of the benefits of religion, but I just don't want to.
Sure.
Let's not frame it as
it's not like he's starting a new religion.
Yeah, he hasn't said that, at least not that I've heard.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Susan, did you want to add anything to that?
You didn't see my note.
She said she was gone.
Oh, sorry.
So I had to run back upstairs. I was grabbing a bite to eat.
Okay, sorry about that.
One thing about I don't think of belief as being such a like being a Christian is such a. I mean, there's. I don't know. Pleasure. What is your name? What do we call you?
Brett. You can call me Brett or POD or Brett,
okay.
however you want.
Okay, let me change the topic. Liberal, conservative. I feel like a lot of in this country, it doesn't seem to me that liberals are very accommodating at all, where I feel conservatives do listen to liberals, but liberals will not listen to conservatives.
I think there's people on both sides that are like that, are more open and aren't. But I'll agree. But I mean, I think this is a people problem. I think, but I mean, we may be going. I don't know if we want to go do it.
Yeah. Okay.
We don't want to go down that.
Say that the tolerance of liberals to me. Maybe I should go downstairs and finish getting my bite to eat.
No. Just I think maybe I think it's probably more helpful to recognize the intolerance from anyone is bad, whether it's is unhelpful, whether it's liberals or conservatives. Like I think you were talking about, like what Vervaeke's saying is, you need both the belief aspect, the knowledge aspect is important, but you also need the being mode, and he's looking for psychotechnologies that help get the optimal, different, the optimal working together of these two.
See, I don't think of Christianity as being just like one particular psychotechnology. I mean, there seems to be just hundreds of them.
Sure.
That are, and there is a meta. There is an area above church practice. People's practice varies in the Christian community just so much, and I don't feel myself stuck at the church level in my Christianity. I think I'm one level above that and more of a meta belief. But
so you could say more that they're a system of psychotechnologies rather than, like, it's probably more accurate not to say a religion is a psychotechnology, but they're a system of psychotechnologies. They're like a collection of them.
Oh yes, very wide variety.
Yes,
and almost infinite. I think it comes down to the person almost. So, but that's just my thoughts.
I guess my hypothesis is the religions that have survived the longest and that are most ingrained to some extent, that's probably a factor of they've developed particularly effective psychotechnologies that play a particularly effective role versus all the thousands of religions that we no longer hear about today because they've just fallen to history.
They're well suited enough to their environment that they can adapt to new situations and circumstances.
Yeah, so I probably have to go and And do something fun with the kids.
Sure. Yeah, I think.
Yeah,
I mean,
we've gone for
well,
almost.
I just wanted.
Yeah,
to
we should finish up.
This last piece out. That and I left when there was some discussion about the tension between conservative and the progressive elements, let's say, of culture and how they need to converse. And then Susan's answer there about the psychotechnologies of Christianity actually being properly split and divided in a much more diverse way. And I think that you can see that there's this process where if you look at any one particular thing, and this is why I have such a misapprehension, let's say, of using group language, you can always further subdivide it. You can always interrogate it a bit and say, do you want to change this thing about culture? And the response is no. Why? So why? And that no, though it is a single response and a single word, will split if I keep asking an infinite number of times, perhaps. But eventually you'll narrow down on some key ideas, right? And you find that all things eventually separate like that there are these components underneath them that build up to them. And that you can do that at really all levels of analysis, it seems. So
I call that bringing it down to its essence, like bringing it down to the essence of the issue.
Or multiple essences, right?
Sure.
Usually it's like several different combined coherent subsystems that when you find a complicated thing. Yeah, so if you manage to get good at doing that, I think you have this capacity that Vervaeke is seeking for, perhaps, right? The capacity to learn which new traditions to incorporate into your sense of things. But it's always should be that you are willing to, when hearing the no, seek further subdivision, seek further understanding, seek further detail.
And that is a disruptive psychotechnology. To say when someone says no, not just accept it instinctively, to push further, that is disrupting just the, like, again, that's probably why it works. It's forcing you out of just the automatic thoughts and forcing you to bring them to your consciousness, to consciously figure out why do you have this or that opinion beyond just your gut instinct for it.
Yep.
You were gonna say something, Sumit?
No, probably it would have been politically incorrect to say, but I'm sure Tyler already knows. Just because a religion has got billions of followers doesn't mean that. I mean, you can get compliance through aggression as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say that just because a religion survived or has got so many followers somehow points at its some sort of inherent enlightenment of its ideas. So let me put it this way.
Well, but why there's been lots of aggression over the years. Why these have survived versus others not? Like I don't think it's a coincidence that Christianity, for example, was taken over. I mean, there's something very there's something that works with Christianity. It's why it started becoming, like, for example, Constantine didn't adopt Christianity until Christianity became powerful enough that it was threatening, his rule. So it's either sort of, go with, I mean, we don't want to get to.
Yeah, I mean, Constantine himself had a religious experience that it coming true led him to.
That's the story, but it was he used them for battle, right? He said, "I will use the cross on my shield. Like you guys help me in battle." Like it was a little more pragmatic than like maybe he said, "I've had a religious experience," but I think there's a political thing, but there's something very attractive about Christianity. It's something that works.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Like so it works on a voluntary scale too. Like even when it's not in power, there are people that will adopt it for themselves because it's, I guess, providing some sort of benefit to them as individuals.
And like paganism, the Roman religion was enforced too for a long time. But I think so I agree with you. Yes, one reason why these religions have survived is because they were enforced. But I think one of the reasons, where my hypothesis is just I've been thinking about this just since Vervaeke, but is one of the reasons these particular religions were chosen to be enforced is because they had a particular resonance that, in terms of these they provided these roles particularly well, where the other ones didn't, and so didn't capture that.
I'm not completely denying your point, but just when you make that point, like you should be like, okay, but that's not the only point. Like it's what Tyler says. There is not a 100% or 0%. There is a spectrum of things.
Right.
So
and I think what you brought up. Sorry, go ahead.
Once you have just small point, after that you can go. So I think once you have something established, right? You may do crystal therapy, okay? I may do touch therapy, right? And we may all have a lot of followers. But in the end, once we have got our business established, it might just be the placebo effect that is working for people, and they come and they are getting benefits, and they're like, oh, this is awesome. So I mean, there are all kind of factors that can go into this.
But I think the science is showing that there's more than just the placebo effect, that there are things that we can sort of recognize certain aspects of these religions that are backed up scientifically for why they're effective. I think that's really one of the things Vervaeke is doing here, is showing that we can make this link. We can study the essence of these things, like take away all the mumbo jumbo aspects, look at what's actually happening, and this works. We can scientifically show this works.
I see.
No, but,
okay, so go ahead.
I really got
okay. After this, I'll shut up.
Thanks.
I can't believe Tyler had to go.
Yeah, I'll listen to it later, Sumit.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, community, being part of a community helps. Being social helps. Hanging out with people helps. All that. So that is part of all religion. So my friends tell me when their mother or whatever used to go to this religious ceremony, she was much more happy, and we were just guessing that it's because you got to socialize, you got to maybe dance a little bit as part of that ceremony, you got to do exercise and all that. So you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not
but
just
those ceremonies that you're talking about are psychotechnologies. I mean, you can compare them to, there's a strong similarity to meditation, I think, with some of these ceremonies, like the repetition, especially the dancing, you're getting into an altered state. Like, you can bring these down into the Vervaeke language and see that there's more going on than just the beliefs. One of the reasons why they're doing this is because it has a disruptive effect. It's a practice that helps with these things. That's why it feels good, I think. So I think we can go a little more deeper and say, okay, chanting, or even the talking in tongues, those ceremonies in the Christian ceremonies, or the one sect, I forget which sect it is, but there's it's very meditative from what I understand. Like, they get into this zone through a meditative state, or the songs can be very hypnotic, right? There's the repetition over and over again. I think there's a lot more scientific under the surface. There's a lot more in common with a lot of these practices than it may seem at first.
I see. So that's interesting. Oh, sorry, Susan. That's interesting then to kind of see the divergence between, like, okay, you can have you had mentioned that, like, I think science is telling us that there's something more than placebo effect going on here, where it's maybe Vervaeke is saying that, the reason religions are effective are because it's speaking about something true about, say, human nature within us.
Not that it's speaking about, that it's forcing you to do practices that then have these beneficial effects. It's not about knowledge. It's being.
Okay.
So the practices of these religions have a similar effect to the psychotechnologies he's talking about. It's not about the knowledge.
Wouldn't it have to be? Well, yeah, sure. It's not about the knowledge, but it's about the relationship then between we as people, like the practice of these psychotechnologies for living our lives. That Well, okay. Well, you said it's not just a placebo effect, but that seems like an element of knowledge. Like what the knowledge is.
Because it's rewiring your brain. When you do these practices over and over again, they rewire your brain. That's what the science of meditation shows. That when you hook these meditators up, like before and after a certain amount of time, you can measure the changes in brain function that a practice does. And I suspect, this is my hypothesis, I'm not an expert opinion, but I suspect that a lot of what's happening in these religious practices is a similar type of effect, that it's rewiring your brain by doing these over and over again.
Gotcha.
Okay, I think, Brett, you're confusing the psychotechnologies, which you have to admit, singing, dancing, meditation, repetition, it can be used in all belief systems.
Right. No, I'm not missing that. That's the point.
That you're confusing, well, maybe not but the use of psychotechnology for the belief system, for the gestalt, and also I am not, and I'm a very scientifically minded person, I am not convinced by the science. I'm really not impressed that Vervaeke has brought forth the science. He has not convinced me.
Sorry, what don't you like? What don't you? What do you find lacking in the science?
Well, just in this series, up to this point, he really hasn't shown us a lot of science. I mean,
he's talked about it and he's linked to it. I mean, to some extent, it's up to us to sort of go and study them, on our own, as well. Right. But I mean, like he does have in the show notes, he links the people he's talking about.
True.
And he's summarizing them.
Yeah, and I've gone and I've listened to lectures by the people that he mentioned. But
so what would you say he's trying to claim then through science that isn't, maybe he's overstepping his bounds, that like it's not necessarily really being shown to be the case exactly?
Yeah, he hasn't presented the material in all the people, all the books, and that he's referenced. He hasn't put forth enough to say, okay, we're going to just agree that the science is backing up what he's saying.
Right.
Well, I think, in fairness to him, he doesn't present any of this as the absolute truth. I think what he says is
But he hints at it.
But what do you think he said is very explicitly, the science has given enough backing to show that this is a plausible way to go that's worth pursuing. And I think the practices that people have gone into has also backed up that it's worth doing, that this type of stuff tends to lead to positive effects versus negative.
I agree on the psychotechnologies, and I believe in the science on that and all that stuff that he said, and the cognitive changes and all that. But trying to then say that, say, like my worldview, Christianity is limited to a set of psychotechnologies that's based on something that's not scientific and is probably wrong. That's taken it a step that he has not brought forth.
Well, I think the point he made was that it's not that any one religion must be wrong, but because there's so many religions, and to some extent,
they can't all be right. They can't all be right.
Right. So he hasn't said, yeah. Like to be clear, he hasn't said this one or that one is wrong. He's only said, at least in this lecture series, generally they can't all be right. Yeah. Sorry.
And I agree with that. Yes, they can't all be right. But he hasn't, and I can see he's hinted towards that, down towards there's going to be a scientific explanation for everything. Don't you think that's where
I haven't heard him say that, but did you?
He's made little sides, like, and the science will show, the science shows, and
but he's not making a prediction there. He's giving his assessment of what the science has shown.
Right.
So he's not predicting what the science will show.
And maybe it's carrying with it the presumption that that is a sufficient explanation for the phenomenon itself. Like the reasoning for this is because of the science that supports it, rather than, I don't know, anything besides that.
I think we have to be fair too. He's giving an overall. He's giving in the science in small bits in an overall lecture. I imagine like he could probably give entire lectures just on the science, where he just goes into a lot more detail. So he's summarizing to some extent.
Sure, but it's definite that to me that he's coming. It's all going to come down to methodological naturalism.
I don't think he's making that point. I don't think he's making a metaphysical point. I think he's sort of like Buddha. He's not focused on the metaphysical truth. He's focused on how do they help us in our daily lives? I think he probably is a metaphysical naturalist, but I don't think any of what he's saying depends on that.
And I think the other point, like we discussed how, like, sure, all these religions might be useful, but that doesn't mean they're all going to be true. And it still raises a point that, yes, there's all these other religions that are also providing this functional purpose for the people within them, that without the religions being there, then they would be, I guess, limited in what they would be able to do. Like you can say that, sure, not all religions are true, but you still have to, at least, I mean, you don't have to, but there's still evidence that's suggesting that all the religions that are currently alive are providing some sort of purpose there.
True, I agree.
But yeah, and then like ideally we'd want to find which religion is both useful, kind of like what Sumit brought up. There's kind of the four elements of, I guess, character or morality, something like that, where you have moral and immoral, and then you have effective and ineffective. So you can have something that's right. Yeah. So you can have like something that's moral and ineffective, and that wouldn't. I mean, sure, it's good, but it would be better if it was moral and also effective. So like you could say, I don't know, Socrates, like he lived a moral, or like he lived out a moral death by standing according to his principles. But I mean, it would have been better if Socrates maybe managed to continue living and maybe.
How much more good could he have done the world if he had given up his principles once to continue his philosophy?
Sure. So, yeah, but that would be like a giving up of his moral character in order to do something. And so like we want to kind of find like what is both effective and moral, because they're like two lines on a graph. Like ideally we want to be moving furthest to the top right and as far away from the bottom left as we can.
See, rather than Vervaeke making a strong case for, non-dualism or, philosophical naturalism, I think his point is more that meaning is compatible with there not being a God. So he's not strongly arguing there is no God, but I think he's strongly arguing you can have just as much meaning and all of this good stuff, even if you don't believe in a God or don't believe in these religions. So I think that's more his focus. That's what I picked up, more his focus than arguing for one or the other. Like he probably wouldn't spend a lot of time arguing with a theist about the metaphysical aspects. He'd want to focus in on, it's like, I don't know, from what I've heard, you'd want to focus on what about the religion is playing a similar role. Because I think he seems to respect the religions. I mean,
mm-hmm. And here's where I think at least his thesis might be insufficient in that I think secularity is sort of a byproduct of superfluous, but what's the opposite of scarcity?
Abundance.
Yes. that having a strong enough society that you're living within, without all these existential risks or dangers that are always knocking at your door, there's less of a requirement to, I guess, like get your affairs in order on a more, I don't know, longer scale. Like that's the thing. Like you can kind of see a correspondence or a correlation between the religiosity of a nation and, say, maybe the number of existential risks that are there, like average lifespan, things like that. And where for the more wealthy nations that you'll have kind of this more secular aspect, because it seems like there's less of that need within religions for them, because they're being provided some of the like sociological needs of religion through other means, like through I don't know, a strong government or neighbors that are share a lot of the same principles and things like that. So I think to an extent Vervaeke's project is viable, but it may only be viable within a very specific framework that our 21st century has provided for us.
Well, but I mean, which makes sense because his whole framework here is a reaction to the 20th century meaning crisis. So this whole thing is in that environment. It's a response to that. So I think you're right, but if the environment were different, he would have a different course, right? So
okay, that's interesting. So he's trying to provide that meaning that's needed, or like, okay, so like we might have had the understanding that, okay, our ancestors needed religion because they didn't have for their existential abundance in order to kind of live out their lives. But even with that abundance, there are still these other facets to religion that are kind of left out, that are only observable upon like the larger scale.
Right. That religion was doing more than just providing superstitious explanations for nature. That was one aspect of it. Okay. You know, you see thunder. Well, there's a thunder god, you know, right? Like you see, you know, water. Okay. There's a god of the oceans, you know, love. There's a god of love. So that's one aspect of it. But there's another aspect of religion that is doing something much more.
Yeah, providing meaning and purpose for like why we're living it. And
so there's a knowing mode and a being mode for religions too. That they have both aspects.
Okay, and so that makes it much more clarifying for what Vervaeke's goal somewhat is. In like we're in the situation that we are right now, where we're in kind of a secular society where the superstitious explanations no longer really provide that same oomph behind them that, say, like scientific explanations do. And so if he can resolve that, the psychological need that was there for people for meaning and purpose, without having to rely upon these explanations that aren't even effective anymore, then that would be like all for the best.
Well, because to be clear, because even though he's secular and even though he's non-believer, I don't see he didn't really go into what the meaning crisis is in those early lectures. I wish he'd spent a little more time on it, but he can't possibly think it just belongs to non-religious people. You know, those are a small proportion of the population. I mean, to some extent, he must be, you know, he like to all of us in this call. You know, I'm non-religious. Some of you are religious. Like we're all, I think, the audience for this lecture. I think so. It's not. Yeah. I think it's
one of the elements that he mentions as like a symptom or something that you can observe regarding the meaning crisis is a distrust in the larger social structures, say like with journalism or our religious, like the Catholic Church and their priest scandals and the government. Like you can't you get to a point where you can't trust that your representatives are actually have you in mind, or like corporations. Like do you really like trust in your boss to do what's best for you? All of these things are like a signifier of there being a meaning crisis occurring, because there's all these I think like he listed several like polls and things like that in regards to people's distrust in their institutions. And yeah, and you can definitely see that within the Western world for us, that and it may be that his prescription will provide greater sustenance than, or not sustenance, but provide a greater resolve to the meaning crisis than the typical religious attempts from our past. And maybe like this is just an opportunity for people like Paul Vanderklay and others to really see what is going to be effective and see where they can work within that field without having to like give up their entire history of religion.
Is that a good place to bring this to start bringing this to a close? It's been going for 3 hours and 10 minutes. I'm starving.
My question.
No,
yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, even I have questions, so I'll go after Susan.
Okay.
Oh, I was just wondering, Brett. You sounds like you looked ahead. On the lectures.
I haven't listened ahead. I had just looked at the. I just looked at what was coming up.
I just wanted to make the point. I'm kind of curious because he mentioned that I haven't either, but he mentioned he was going to go into the Mediterranean background. So I'm kind of curious if he's going to back off this Buddhism thing.
Well, I think next episode he seems to be moving on. What was it, Epicureans or something?
Yeah, back to the Greeks. So yeah, he's kind of going all over. Yeah, especially since there's still the elements of some Greek thought within Christianity, and like there's certain almost sort of Stoic thinkers within Christianity, like it's Epicureanism, Stoicism, and something else, I think.
Okay, yeah, I didn't look at the points or anything. I'm looking forward to that. So, you guys meeting next week, same time?
Yep.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah, I think so. At least, unless things change, but yeah, we should be.
God willing. Haha.
Yeah. All right, Sumit.
Yeah, so can you explain that point about losing trust in institutions, where can you really trust your boss to do the right thing for you, and somehow that kind of stuff is leading to the meaning crisis? Because I mean, come on, guys, you got good jobs, you got good homes that keep themselves warm, and you got health insurance at your workplace, you probably got work from home, and now you are saying that your boss can't be trusted to do the right thing for you. I mean, we come a long way from working in the unhealthy places.
Yeah, it seems like one thing that you could, like, if you were to, at least one element that you could use to describe the meaning crisis is discontent with the institutions that have power, and so part of that.
And they have taken care of us. I mean, like, I think Sumit's saying, we all have food, we have roofs over our heads, we have a means, something, a job, work. What else in the history of the world? What else do we really need?
No, that's not. I mean, I wasn't saying that if you have all these things, you shouldn't. I mean, that what else do you need? Maybe you need some sort of, I don't know, whatever this fulfillment or calling or whatever it is called. But what I was saying was that what John was saying was that somehow distrust in the institutions, and he brought up the particular example of workplace, is somehow connected to the meaning crisis. But I would think the other way around. All these things should give you a cushion to actually explore yourself further and investigate and do all those things, because you already have anti-harassment policies, all kinds of regulations to protect the employees. So I mean, in that situation, how can all those protections be connected to be leading to the meaning crisis? I mean, the boss can pretty much go fuck himself, because we got all these rules and regulations. He can't abuse you, right? So
Yeah, but okay. So in order to move upwards in your job, you're going to have to like devote a much greater amount of time there than all the other people.
I'm starving, and my focus is just gone. So I'm gonna say bye. But think it was amazing,
okay.
And we'll be back back next week. But
yes,
thanks, guys. I have to stop. Sorry.
All right, thanks, Brett. Yeah. Well, I'll just answer this, and then we'll wrap up. So
thank you very much, Brett.
Oh no, it's great. Well, here I'll hold on. If you're just wrapping up for this question, then I'll. Then
that was just something that he had mentioned in the first episode. I don't remember the exact complete description of how it connects to the meaning crisis, but that was at least one element that people aren't happy with or people aren't provided with enough reason for living from just living the corporate 9-to-5 type of job, something like that, which you can kind of see from a lot of the movies from the 90s. There's that sort of discontent with the modern lifestyle that has been given to people with movies like Fight Club and Matrix and Office Space, those types of things. All right. Thanks all of you guys for joining in. This was a really great conversation. I'm glad we had like all of us able to kind of bring in our perspectives and actually work off of each other here and like have our disagreements and kind of get a better understanding for all of it. So that was really cool. If anybody wants to join in for these types of discussions, we have links down below to our Discord, and we'll be talking about this next week. Just to plug one thing, just this Wednesday, I was on Think Club's channel, and I did a debate that actually Brett helped me kind of prepare for.
You did really well. Yeah, that was really good. And I might say that each time, like we did practice, each time you did it, it was like amazing. Like it was like a different presentation each time, and it got better and better each time. And so I think you nailed it on the last one.
Yeah, you provided great advice, really, too. So like, if anybody wants to like really hone their ideas, use Brett because he's really able to pin down like what you're kind of lacking. It's up on Think Club's channel. It's Are we living inside of a Matrix-like simulation?
You know what? I've never seen it, The Matrix. Should I see it? Because I hear.
Yeah, you should see it. It's on Netflix, I think.
Yeah.
You definitely have to see the Matrix. Yeah,
definitely.
Yes, I just sent in my Netflix subscription, and I won't tell you why, but you can probably guess.
It's kind of a cultural icon for a lot of people, I think, the Matrix. So having an understanding, you don't need to watch the other two, but at least the first one, it'll definitely provide you with a lot of a lot of things that you can get a better reading for the culture.
Yeah. All right. Rent it. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody for stopping by. All right. I'm ending the stream.